This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people had so much to gain and had such a material motive for putting me in a position I'm in. We'll never let the true facts come about boys to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember his name. You don't remember the name of the person who involved you in murder?
Now these people are in very high positions, Jack.
Yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 16. I'm your co-host Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today we are going to, I guess, get back to some real politique topics, and which are quite spooky and do have a Halloweenish theme to them, seeing as they took place in a certain fateful October, and this is also something that is definitely relevant to the month that we're living through right now, and a term that is being used on probably an almost daily basis for the next several weeks, which is the October surprise.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people think it's almost like a normalized term in the American political lexicon now that, an October surprise is something that a campaign will bust out several weeks before a presidential election. That's like a game changer. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people actually are not. I think if you asked a lot of people, where does this term come from? What was the first October surprise? And I mean, granted, I think you probably could go through American history and find earlier examples of this, but like the way the term entered the modern lexicon specifically refers to the presidential campaign of 1980 between President Jimmy Carter and former California Governor Ronald Reagan. Yes. And I don't know. I think this spawned. I mean, it's interesting how normalized the term has come as a kind of, a tactic or something that is sort of accepted as a part of political reality, even though this specific story from 1980 has basically been kind of totally rejected by the Washington press corps and buried multiple times, or they have attempted to bury it, but then it kind of like some kind of Jason Voorhees, its hand just like shoots up out of the dirt and it crawls back to life, or at least it did for, I'd say, about 12 years during the Reagan-Bush years.
Yeah, it's also interesting how the term October surprise can almost more often than not nowadays denote something that truly is a surprise to both candidates involved, like in an American presidential election, like something that like changes the discourse of the landscape in such a way, like if a mass shooting happens, that could be like an October surprise without necessarily having to be engineered, that would make someone's like pro-gun stance look worse, something like that.
That is true. That is true. You could think of things like Hurricane Sandy in 2012 was one such, perhaps, and even, of course, like the Benghazi attacks were also another thing that had no ostensible connection to.
They weren't engineered by either side, but in the 1980 example, both the fear of an October surprise on the part of the Republicans was that Carter would engineer some kind of October surprise.
Yeah.
And also, like, the actual October surprise sort of conspiracy that, gave the term its name was also something that was very much engineered and understood to be engineered.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's interesting that actually, yeah, even the original term in 1980 of October Surprise actually originally, you're right, it referred to a fear among the Reagan-Bush campaign that Carter was going to do this very public resolution to the hostage crisis in September, October, and basically flip the momentum of the race. And at that time, that was one of the main things kind of dragging him down was Carter's inability to secure the release of these hostages, which in one of the books we read, interestingly, that election day 1980, I think it was on November 4th, I could be wrong, but it was the exact 1-year anniversary of the storming of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. And so basically the news media was playing all kinds of retrospectives and devoting a lot of coverage to it alongside the election, which definitely did not help Carter. And the polls were very tight. Reagan did get to lead, I think, over the summer for a while. And so it wasn't illogical to project that he might win and become the next president. But in September and October, the polls began to tighten again. And I think it's kind of it's hard to say for sure whether or not, if Carter had been able to pull that off, that he would have won re-election. But I would say that it would have greatly increased his odds of winning re-election.
Yeah, and another thing that was really interesting to me in reading like a lot of the sort of materials about the October Surprise and the sources, that I read as part of the research for this episode, it was interesting to see the Republicans talk about Carter, because I feel like the contemporary idea of Carter is almost as this man who is sort of too naive for the presidency, or like too good-hearted for Washington politics, but the portrayal of him by the Republicans at that time was that this was someone who was so sort of politically canny that he would do this, at the last minute and sort of, plan it. And he was portrayed as someone who's very politically tough and shrewd, which is not really I think that Carter actually was very shrewd politically, but certainly that's not the way that he's been remembered. He's been remembered as kind of like, Mr. Smith goes to Washington type, which was part of his image. But
it was part of his image, and it's interesting going through some of the sources that we went through, how there are these kind of that is definitely a dominant perception of from a lot of the people in the Republican camp, that they basically, it's often said in the context of they were right to be worried about this hostage situation because Carter, all that humanitarian peanut farmer governor stuff was all bullshit, and that he was absolutely going to manipulate the hostage crisis to benefit his reelection prospects. But at the same time, there are other people that I went through in one of the books we're going to be talking about. There's actually an interview with Miles Copeland, who is a really fascinating and mysterious CIA figure, like an old school covert action overseas cowboy, who is one of the top Arabists in the CIA, and was actually, I think, at some point kind of an informal advisor to Nasser in Egypt, and I think engineered what actually never gets talked about was one of the very first CIA-involved military coups in anywhere in the world, which was a coup in 1949 in Syria. So he went very far back in the entire Middle East region, but he said something along the lines of, Carter was this idealistic guy, and the reporter describes him as almost like waving his hands around in disbelief, like he actually believed this shit. Like, can you imagine, like a president of the United States actually thinking that you should do things for idealistic principles? Like he almost couldn't wrap his head around it. It was so silly to him. So I think Carter kind of had like a mix of that stuff going on. Of course, like he had people like Zbigniew Brzezinski as his national security advisor, who was like in his own way like an extreme hawk, anti-communist, anti-Soviet kind of hawk, and they did craft the kernel of what would become Operation Cyclone in basically supporting the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan, though, of course, Reagan's administration and specifically the people that are involved in this October surprise narrative, like escalated it to kind of unimaginable levels. But I mean, Carter in a way is kind of that classic liberal, where he's kind of cynical and you know, willing to get his hands dirty a little bit, but also still kind of almost for his own psychological edification needs to sort of actually stand up for these principles. And
yeah, I think so. I think he definitely is idealistic, for sure. But I don't think that's a contradiction with this is someone who has, like, you know, very, like, you know, honed political instincts and was, like, you know, a skillful political operator. But yeah, I think in a way, I saw someone on Twitter, you know, the other day, you know, I hope you will forgive me bringing up just the sort of doom scrolling of Twitter, but I think that, you know, many of our audience probably do the same thing. And I just saw, you know, the same kind of benign point where, or you know, banal point where people are like, you know, saying like, oh, I understand the Republicans, you know, they're greedy, but what motivates these Democrats? What motivates Kamala Harris, like, and Pete Buttigieg? Like, it's just chilling to contemplate. Like, it's like, well, you know, they want attention. They have this self-image that they want to sort of sustain. You know, they like want to, you know, be in it. They want to be in the room where it happens. You know, like they like so. You know, that's.
I mean, I think it's not surprising, pardon the pun, at all.
No,
that
exactly,
that kind of liberal, you know, liberal politicians in Washington would be attracted to the idea of kind of playing like the good cop. Mm-hmm. And to an extent, in certain cases throughout it hasn't always been true, but sometimes that has been the case. Certainly, I think if you're contrasting with somebody like Ronald Reagan, or as Carter was even doing when he was running, kind of contrasting himself with Richard Nixon, it's an easy sell, I think, to yourself that you are a more principled alternative and a more morally upright alternative to this ogre that wants to, like, nuke Moscow back to the Stone Age or something, you know, and flirts around with, like, racists and all that stuff. So I think it's it absolutely makes sense how they would be motivated. And it's just that, you know, I mean, at a certain point you have to sort of put down the idealism and take the paycheck and do the quote-unquote right thing for the people that actually wield the kind of long-term power in this country. And you can't go against them, you know, even though like Carter was sponsored by the Trilateral Commission, which of course was like founded by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski, and kind of but I think in a way, and you know, maybe someday down the road, there was an interesting book by Carl Oglesby, former SDS guy in the 70s, called The Cowboy and Yankee War, which was an attempt, I read it a few years ago, so I'm a little fuzzy, but it was a kind of interesting attempt to map the intra-ruling class conflicts in America from, say, the 1950s through the 1970s, and actually incorporated a lot of, he basically hypothesized that the assassinations of JFK and Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, etc., were kind of the hottest you know, the hottest actions in this Cowboy and Yankee War. Those were his terms to kind of roughly sum up the two most dominant kind of business elites and ruling class elites at that time, and how they had, while they were both definitely imperialists and capitalists, they had different kind of strategy on how to confront the Soviet Union, how to increase, you know, American power in the world. And so the Yankees were like the kind of northeastern old money WASP banking establishment, which included people like maybe the Rockefellers and you know, the Vanderbilts, the DuPonts, people like that. And then you kind of had, particularly down in the West and down in Texas, you had kind of these relatively newer money robber baron oil millionaires and billionaires who, you know, had kind of come up out of they didn't have that old money lineage, you know, their ancestors weren't on the Mayflower, you know, but they had a ton of money. And, you know, especially with the sort of later, flimsier political systems that were set up in, like, you know, places like Texas or California or Colorado or Wyoming, it's like they basically were able to run these states as like their own fiefdoms and completely control them. So and then, of course, when the military-industrial complex exploded, a lot of military bases and industry of that kind was moved to the West. So they found themselves with kind of this power. And I guess one of the things just like an example of like where these two parties would clash with each other is over prioritizing maintaining American influence in Europe, which was like the Atlanticist, the Yankee position, basically, and then the more adventurous kind of strategy of the Cowboys, which really wanted like hot war in Central and South America and Asia. And they were people that were like probably the most vocally in support of a Vietnam War happening. And so to whatever extent there was like official sanction for a kind of anti-war sentiment in the 60s and early 70s, it was kind of for strategic reasons, which of course, are easily laundered into humanitarian, objections to. That's why I think maybe you saw like ruling class kids like John Forbes Carey, go before the Senate and like throw his medals down and stuff like that. It's like, was he really like a radical rejecting the system? Definitely not. But I think, I think it's interesting that the anti-war movement was like to some degree tolerated instead of just viciously cracked down on, like with communists and like earlier civil rights activists in the 50s and 60s. So that's just one, maybe an interesting thing to keep in mind as we like dive into this narrative is that, you could say on the one hand, like, yes, these are all capitalists. Like, what do we care that they were all kind of fighting and backstabbing with each other? They're all the same imperialists at the end of the day. But I think it's definitely valuable to examine the fault lines in the different kind of strategic influence, because it wasn't. I think it's easy nowadays to accept the 1980s and the Reagan policies, particularly the Reagan foreign policies, but also like the economic neoliberalism as just sort of an inevitable next chapter in history that just like had to happen because we had hyperinflation and blah blah blah. And the Soviets, they're just evil empire, etc. And now people say, oh, well, they were going to collapse anyways. But in some other books that I'm reading that
at the time nobody thought that they would ever collapse.
Absolutely not. I'm still in the middle of reading a book that I think I'm going to cite heavily maybe in our next chapter in this series of episodes, because this is merely a jumping off point. But it's Peter Schweitzer's Victory, and if anybody is like, if the name Peter Schweitzer sounds familiar, it's because he is been popular like on Fox News over the last few years. He wrote that book called like Clinton Cash from 2016 that a lot of like right-wing people held up as like, oh, the Clintons, and so that's kind of his that's sort of his MO these days. But he's actually kind of a like quote unquote historian, and I had to laugh when I looked up his Wikipedia again recently, because he is literally, his job description is he is the William J. Casey Fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University.
Wow.
And he actually wrote this kind of amazing book called Victory from 1994 that basically outlines the Reagan administration's secret covert operations to economically, culturally, militarily, politically, etc., like undermine and destroy the Soviet Union. And of course, this is in the early 90s. So basically all of the people, he interviews like all of the biggest ghouls in the Reagan administration, and they're all just bragging about everything they did because they're still like in the afterglow of like, we fucking won the Cold War, man. Like, let me tell you what I did, and let me tell you what Bill Casey did. And you realize that like they embarked on a very specific strategy that I don't think that, as much as Zbigniew Brzezinski hated the Soviet Union and wanted to like give the Soviets their own Vietnam and Afghanistan, a lot of these things were not kind of in the table. They weren't on the table as options, as like something that was like responsible or prudent to do. The Reagan crowd that is at the center of this October surprise story, they totally kind of changed the ball game. They reinvigorated the CIA. They like pumped it full of steroids, because Carter did he laid off almost like 800 case officers, and a lot of the people in the Reagan-Bush orbit were super pissed off about this. They felt like that basically Carter was kind of just like marking time and not playing offense, and Soviet encroachment was increasing everywhere around the world. It was imminent. So ironically, these people who hated communism had a much stronger assessment of it, that it needed to be actively undermined by kind of any means necessary. And I have to say, like, you know, I think what they did was, as we will get into like later, they engaged in some of the most evil shit of probably the late 20th century, but I think it worked. And so I think we should, you know, take seriously that that these people had to get into the White House in 1980. They had to take control of the White House to change the course of foreign policy, to end détente with the Soviet Union, and basically launch a full-scale economic, political, and mind war against the Eastern Bloc.
Yeah, and I think that this is definitely valuable. I mean, you've often talked about the Iran-Contra events as like a node that, you know, is very crucial in an entire web of different conspiracies and different, you know, ops throughout, like that goes into the past and also into the future. Something that definitely came to mind, I mean, you mentioned the sort of support for certain radical movements in the United States, which is something that I think has a parallel to today. And also, I think that there's certainly a parallel to today. This kind of resembles, I mean, it's not like a very good, it's a flawed analogy in many ways, but there are certainly analogs one could draw and comparisons one could draw to Russiagate and some of this stuff.
Yeah, I think particularly the October surprise scandal itself, because we've just lived through 3.5 years of people alleging basically another October surprise that has treasonous implications for the Republican who, you know, won as a result of it. And yeah, though I think we will see that it is kind of, once you dig into the substance of these things, whereas...
I think there's more to it than Russiagate, for sure. But, like, you know, it's interesting to think of it in those terms. And, you know, it invites a slight reassessment of Russiagate, perhaps, you know. But,
well, I think it does. So I guess maybe now's a good time to like sort of get into like the really like the what of the October surprise and like what specifically was alleged to have been done. So basically the allegations that started coming out really not too much until the late 1980s when George H.W. Bush, who had been VP for 2 terms, was running for president. A number of people started coming out and making claims about certain suspicious activities of Reagan-Bush campaign officials in the fall of 1980, in the final stretch, pretty much exactly where we are right now with our election, where it was neck and neck in the polls. And the allegation is that basically William J. Casey, who was Reagan's the Reagan-Bush campaign manager, and I know we've mentioned him before, but he was an OSS veteran in World War II, went on to have like a ton of government positions, and then, of course, after Reagan won, became his CIA director from 81 until he suddenly got a brain tumor and died in 1987. But basically, he's the central figure in these allegations, which are that he basically flew over primarily to Paris in October 1980 and held a series of clandestine secret meetings with Iranian officials, specifically representatives of Ayatollah Khomeini's new government, and basically struck a deal to give Iran anywhere from between, the numbers vary, but like between $50 and $150 million worth of weapons and military equipment in exchange for Khomeini and the Iranians not releasing the hostages from the U.S. Embassy until after the election. And thus, I mean, and basically, you know, as we've already mentioned, that there was a perception that if Carter was able to do this, that he would get a bump in the polls and that people would probably reelect him. But if they didn't, then he would look like a weak failure and Reagan would win. And then in exchange for the Iranians doing the Republicans this favor, they would get a big stockpile of weapons and military equipment that they needed that actually had been already purchased by the Shah's government. But then when he was overthrown, they were held in American military facilities like on the East Coast. And basically, so they had this huge warehouse of military equipment that Iran needed. And the Republicans said, well, hey, you know, we'll give all that stuff to you. If you hold off and, you know, make Carter lose, basically. And so, I mean, and then, of course, like, I think the first thing that people ever noticed way back in 1981, and, like, I remember learning this in grade school and being psyoped by it because it just sounded, it's like, you know, it's such a Hollywood ending where basically, like, 20 minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president on January 20th, 1981, all of the U.S. hostages were freed by the Iranians. Yeah. And the story at the time that is still in, I think was in my like middle school history books, is that the Iranians were so afraid of cowboy badass Ronald Reagan riding into town on his horse that basically they shook in their tunics and decided to just like release the hostages like 10 minutes after Reagan got sworn in because they're afraid he was going to come, you know, pound Tehran into dust or invade them or something like that. And so it was meant that the Republicans, you know, used it sounds not unlike something somebody would say about Trump today. It's like, he's so strong that they were just afraid of him and blah,
about
blah, blah.
ISIS or something. He defeated ISIS instantly. Like Obama just wasn't trying hard enough because he was a Muslim or whatever. And once Trump, you know, did it. Exactly.
So that became part of the lore of Reagan, that like there's a new sheriff in town and she's going to get pushed around like nerdy little Jimmy Carter, and even our enemies are going to have to respect us because we're not a bunch of pussies anymore, you know. And of course, you know, the Iranians have done a very good job of kind of humiliating America for the year that they held these hostages. I mean, they would like use American flags to like pick up trash around the compound. They would put these hostages on TV blindfolded and kind of, you know, make them like read like revolutionary, you know, pronouncements and stuff like that. I think they might have made them do that, like denounce America and things like that. It was just like a very big kind of PR nightmare as well as a geopolitical loss for, you know, this is the most populous country in the Middle Eastern region that we were incredibly strong allies with for almost for like over 20 years. And this just, you know, not only was it a huge L to take, but they were just mocking America and making us look like a bunch of chumps. But thank God we elected Ronald Reagan because he scared them right off. But of course, at the bare minimum, we know, because we now know that Iran-Contra was exposed, that even if you totally discount the October surprise narrative, that had to be bullshit on so many levels.
Yes. Of course, it goes on with like the typical, I mean, it really is like, it's hilarious, but it's one of those many like mainstream narratives like that people just don't question, like kind of like Betsy Ross and the American flag, as we discussed in our episode 13, which is on 13. But like the idea of like the malaise speech, you know, Jimmy Carter was just, he was negative about America, you know, and Ronald Reagan came in, he had a positive attitude and he like showed everyone what's what. But you talk about like how this sort of, it's interesting to sort of follow the path of this story, this idea, because as you say, it didn't really come out until some years after it happened. it didn't enter the mainstream, at least. It really, a lot of the initial discussion of this was actually like in the LaRouche sphere.
Yes, it was.
You know,
it was.
Yeah. And one of the
he was a very prolific promulgator of conspiracy information in the 1980s, which he probably deserves his whole own episode because he does pop up in several of these scandals, and he definitely had it out for. He was one of these people that kind of had a soft spot for Ronald Reagan, but like despised George H.W. Bush. Mm-hmm. And saw them as kind of, he was a usurper that had wiggled his way onto the Reagan ticket. And Reagan was kind of maybe a kind of honest actor and trying to introduce some kind of like strong Hamiltonian economics like back to America or something.
It's interesting. That's something, again, a pattern that we see repeated now where people are like Trump, the people around him like are venal, like insiders. Like, but Trump is like, he's good, but, same sort of like thinking. With those types, like, kind of does repeat, but
So he started floating the earliest versions of his executive intelligence review publication.
Yeah, and what really gave it a boost was when Abu Hassan Bani Sadr, who was the at one time the prime minister of Iran after the revolution, or he was the first president of Iran.
First president, elected and then kind of run out of the country.
And then quickly impeached, because he got basically into trouble with the clerics, or the mullahs, as they're called. They started to be called around the time of these events and have been called ever since. Just very idiomatically, the mullahs. Yeah, exactly. The mullahs. Just like with the hatred in your voice. But anyway, so because he sort of had some rifts with them, he was forced out. There was a lot of, just chaos in the legislature after the revolution, as one would imagine. And there was definitely disagreement, like, prior to the revolution and after, about, like, how the system should be organized, especially in terms of division of power between kind of a Republican Democratic system and one that was sort of governed by clerics. So he ended up basically being impeached. And one of the main reasons why he was impeached was because not only was he perceived to be moving against clerics, but he also had certain ties with a group that we've talked about before, the MBK. He had very strong links to them afterwards. Probably, there was maybe some substance to the allegations that he had links to them. Anyway, so he was the one who eventually, in 1987, started to publish op-eds and imply that there had been this sort of agreement that took place.
And I think that's when we started to see a whole flood of very colorful characters come out and start to share in this very Rashomon kind of way their recollections or rumors they had heard about these secret meetings that had happened, primarily in Paris, though there were also allegations of meeting at the Ritz-Carlton, at the Ritz Hotel in Madrid earlier in the summer, and then there was also a confirmed meeting at the L'Enfant Plaza Hotel in Washington, D.C. with a couple Reagan officials and an Iranian, a mysterious Iranian representative. But the main allegation was that I think it was at the Waldorf, Florida hotel in Paris in mid-October. And of course, like, all these things came out in the wake of the Iran-Contra revelations that kind of started in 1985 and then became a pretty big scandal, the one that was almost totally like covered up and nobody was held accountable for. But that did, I think, there had been mumblings about maybe there was some kind of weird thing that happened in 1980, but most of the Washington press corps totally wrote it off as ridiculous. But then when all these reports started coming out, and I think it was actually a Lebanese newspaper that first reported that later on in the 80s, when Reagan was president, there were secret arms for hostages schemes, I think related to the hostages that were held in Lebanon, in Beirut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that basically, even though we were supposedly an avowed enemy of Iran, that nonetheless we basically brokered, I think with the assistance of figures in Israel, a kind of pipeline for selling, I think in the later 80s, it was like Tau, like anti-tank missiles and things like that. Because, of course, the other big thing happening that is really critical to this story in terms of the motivations involved is that Iraq, Saddam Hussein attacked Iran in the fall of 1980 and started what became the 8-year Iran-Iraq war. And you start to get in a very kind of dicey territory really quick, because you realize that the diplomatic games going on between all these different countries is a lot more complicated than you might think by what their kind of outward political alliances would say. And that's like definitely true for Israel, and it's also, in a strange way, it is true for revolutionary Iran, because they basically had a problem after coming into power in 1979, the Iranians, where they had mostly U.S. military equipment, but all of it had been held up and, withheld from them after they kicked out the Shah. And I guess at the time there were things, especially for their fighter jets, that they needed. Like they were in dire need of tires for F-4 Phantom fighter jets and for certain spare parts for F-14s. And to hold up their military capacity, because they were already anticipating that Saddam Hussein, sensing the instability and weakness, was going to try to seize, I'm forgetting the name of the province right now, a certain oil-rich province on the Iran-Iraq border, and was going to take advantage of their, the chaos and instability in Iran. So they wanted to be ready for that, and so that led to that. But then Carter had announced a kind of total embargo on Iran and said, you guys aren't getting anything as long as you are holding those hostages. And that was one thing that some of the CIA veterans kind of criticized him for. Miles Copeland actually said that, look, when those hostages got, captured, it's like a lot of us in the government weren't that sympathetic, because that's just a part of the job. You get paid in countries that are more dangerous. I got time and a half pay when I was in Beirut, years back, and that's just the nature of the game. So, if you get, caught by some revolutionary uprising and taken hostage, that's what you signed up for. So, which I think in one of these books, that's used to kind of show that the kind of maudlin, we just cared about getting the hostages out as soon as possible,
right, yeah,
kind of excuses, not necessarily sincere, representative of how these spooky intelligence officials would tend to think about it.
Yeah, or Reagan saying, I tried to do stuff on the other side, I really, I just felt so bad about what was going on, and I just wanted to help,
As if all these Republicans would go out of their way and even do things that were, questionably illegal to basically deliver a huge win for Jimmy Carter and destroy their own chance at winning the presidency. Sounds very believable.
So absurd, yeah, exactly. Why are you doing this? Why are you taking time away from your presidential campaign to it doesn't make any sense. Because you're such an important statesman that you need to it's bizarre.
None of these guys really have. None of the people in the Reagan-Bush orbit have particularly good, rock solid kind of alibis, or just the things they've said about the things that they did engage in, but in a totally innocent way. They just don't withstand any kind of scrutiny. I mean, if you know anything about these figures, particularly Bill Casey, who has probably one of the kind of shadowiest, most notorious reputations for being a cloak and dagger, old spy man who would fly around the world constantly. And you know, this wasn't even necessarily known very well in 1980, but in, you know, biographies and stuff that were written about him after his death and the way he acted as Reagan's CIA director. I've been reading in this Peter Schweitzer book, he talks about how Bill Casey had like an all-black like C-130 private plane with like no tail numbers, and he would fly around the world constantly with it and do it in a secret way so that nobody could ever track, you know, where his plane was going. And it was actually outfitted to be like a hotel suite so that he could like shower and like eat meals, and like it had a full bed in it, and also like top notch like kind of radio equipment on it so that he could phone anybody in the world and in an untraceable way. And so, you know, people weren't, even though he didn't have like the super spy black plane in 1980, this was definitely in line with his MO to like people saying like, I think his widow said at one point, like, I can't believe that Bill would fly off to Paris like 3 weeks before an election when he was the campaign manager. That doesn't sound like Bill. But it's like everything else I've read about Bill, that sounds exactly like what he would do, especially if this is the one thing that can clinch victory for them. Of course he would go. And so like we ended up reading kind of like two main sources to kind of dig through, which are both interesting in their own ways. The one that I dug through the most was Trick or Treason by Robert Perry, which was released in 1993. And if anybody knows anything about Iran-Contra, Robert Perry was a pretty big journalistic figure in that. He, I think, wrote the first Newsweek articles about the plane that was shot down by the Sandinistas in 1985 with Eugene Hasenfus, who is a CIA contract employee that had weapons on it, and then kind of started to blow it up. But as he describes throughout this book, he eventually circled back to the October surprise narrative. He did a PBS Frontline episode that you can find on archive.org, called Investigating the October Surprise. I think that came out in 1992 during the election year. That is a pretty good overview of his investigation into this stuff. But he says that, you know, he was kind of much like Gary Webb, who we might talk about in our next Iran-Contra episode. Like, his career was kind of totally marginalized, and people started thinking of him in the Washington Press Corps as a, quote, conspiracy theorist. And it kind of really messed up his career. And then, so in the 90s, after all this, he started Consortium News, which people might still read today. That's one of those websites that I think like Andrea Chalupa like declared was a Russian disinformatia website after 2016 because they doubted the Russiagate narrative. And Robert Perry actually died like right after the election of 2016, so he's no longer with us. But did some good work. And the other book that we read was Barbara Honegger's October Surprise, and I think you dove into that one more deeply. Yeah. And she was a Reagan administration official, right? Right, yeah. She was like a smaller, like, public appointee, you know, who worked for Reagan. There's actually, like, this came out in 1989, so a little bit earlier than Robert Perry's book. It's interesting, like, because I felt that there's some sus aspects to Honegger. I feel like she got taken in a little bit by one of the more interesting figures in the whole milieu of this conspiracy and the whole Iran-Contra thing, which is Oswald Lewinter, who figures as Informant Y in her book. But I think I actually, relative to what we've kind of been talking about sort of like the, the conventional narratives, like the almost kind of like religious dimension to this, I really wanted to read this one part of her book because I think it gives an interesting sort of picture. Okay. So this is from her 5th chapter, which is called Once Upon a Perfect Timing. And she writes, 2 quote-unquote miracles happened when Ronald Reagan took the oath of office as President of the United States. The first was made in heaven, the second very much on earth.
as I and other Reagan staffers huddled in the gray chill that 20th day of January 1981, awaiting the moment when everything we had worked so long and so hard for was about to come true, an unexpected and heightened sense of anticipation came over me. It had to do with something more than the joyous initiation ritual we were about to experience. It felt as if something else, something quote-unquote greater, ellipsis, even miraculous, were about to happen. I became alert. Far in the distance on the inaugural platform, for the first time in U.S. history, facing west to the White House instead of east. Wow. Ronald Reagan stepped to the platform. As he placed his hand upon a well-worn family Bible, a hush fell over the crowd. Was this, quote-unquote, it? Was this the, quote-unquote, miracle I sensed about to happen now? But the oath passed without incident. So she's getting this, like, weird feeling that there's some kind of miracle that's about to happen. And something very weird. She goes through this sort of weird West Wingy sort of story where, she's still expecting this miracle, like endlessly expecting it. And she does this weird thing where, some staffers on a podium are being sworn in, like taking oaths of office. And she's in the audience, but she raises her right hand and takes the oath, with them. Very, very QAnon, So, like, she does this weird thing where she's not supposed to do this, but she's doing it. And then she tries to, like, weasel her way into, like, a photo op for the people who were on stage. And they're like, did you take the oath? And she's like, yes, I did take the oath. And they're like, did you take it on stage? And, and so she kind of has this weird thing. And then later on, she sees the president, and he walks up to her and he raises his right hand and she raises hers and he gives her a wink. And, and she's like, wow, Ronald Reagan, like, it's so, it's really, yeah.
Super cute.
Yeah, wow. Yeah. And she's like, well, was that it? Then, she goes and she's telling the story to her friend, Martin Anderson, about, how this happened. And, he's like, well, that's just Reagan. That's just the kind of guy he is, the swell fellow. But then he goes like, did you see it? And she's like, what do you mean it? And what he's referring to is that, she actually quotes from Martin Anderson's own book, A Revolution, which I guess is about Reagan, his election and everything. So everything was perfect. It got even better. President-elect Reagan stood and took the oath of office administered by the Chief Justice of the United States, Warren Burger. Then came his inaugural address. Reagan walked to the podium, and as he raised his head to look out at the crowd assembled in front of him and speak, a strange thing happened. The dark, cloudy sky over his head began to part slightly. Within seconds, there was a gaping hole in the gray overcast, and a brilliant golden shaft of wintry sun burst through the clouds and bathed the inaugural stand and the watching crowd. As Reagan spoke, a slight breeze ruffled his hair and the warm golden light beamed down upon him. Later, a few minutes after he finished speaking, as if on cue from some master lighter backstage, the hole in the cloud shrank, the sky darkened, and Washington grew gray and cold once again. So basically, like a light from heaven, like burst open, and funnily enough, after that, Barbara Honegger says that she heard from someone, a retired intelligence officer, that what might have happened was a special kind of satellite called a keyhole.
I was just gonna say.
Yeah, used a beam to burn holes in the cloud cover. Which is interesting because later on Barbara Honegger would become like a 9/11 truther who would like promote the idea of like energy weapons being used to destroy the Twin Towers. So it's interesting that even in this book she has a sort of weird energy weapon idea. But
I wonder if there's a link to that, like to sort of validate the beam theory of, well, I guess it would be a bummer for her if it was a satellite doing it, not God.
Well, she does, because she writes even to this day. I believe that the ray of light which shone down on Ronald Reagan as he began his inaugural address that cold, wintry day in January 1981 was a genuine act of God. But then she writes, but the release of hostages only moments before, as he completed his oath of office, was almost certainly an act not of God, but of the quote-unquote party of God and of his own.
Does she mean Hezbollah?
Yeah, she means Hezbollah. So there's a lot of sort of like spooky invocations of Hezbollah, like, and hushed terms, like in this, like, she writes, like, it is not without reason that the Iranians are considered the shrewdest and most cunning bargainers on earth. There's, like, a lot of that stuff.
This sounds very much like, in Russian culture, children are taught to do disinformatia at a very young age.
Yes, absolutely. It's absolutely like that. So, like, Reagan is kind of above the fray in the book in, like, a very weird way. And also, like, again, like, I think that maybe in the Robert Perry book, Oswald de Winter was, like, an important figure, but a lot of Barbara Honegger's book is based on this guy, Informant Y, who turns out to be this weird individual, Oswald de Winter, who was, like, a Shakespeare scholar and English professor who, like, officially, what they'll tell you is that he was obsessed with the intelligence community and wanted to be a part of it and would pretend to be, but what seems to really be the case, and what Robert Perry suggested in his Frontline documentary, and I think he told me in his book as well, is that this guy is basically a disinformation agent who was there to, like, muddy the pot and sort of, just leak out so much, like, nonsense that the whole idea of this October surprise conspiracy would be poisoned.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, he would jump to public prominence in the summer of 1988 when he called into a talk radio show on KFI in Los Angeles and called himself Mr. Racine, and I guess with a very bad Southern accent proceeded to talk about his personal knowledge of the October surprise conspiracy, and I think said that that Bill Casey, George H.W. Bush, Donald Gregg, who was a career CIA guy, and Richard Allen, who was a Reagan, kind of a Reagan aide and loyalist, who became Reagan's first national security advisor in 1981, that they were all in Paris with representatives of the Ayatollah, and they hashed out this deal, and basically it like reintroduced this story into the national conversation in the summer of 1988. And I guess at the same time he was feeding information to Barbara Honegger, whose book came out in 1989. And even though I guess from what you could gather that she is very trusting of this source, who eventually became one of his like former students recognized his voice on the radio and outed him to journalists. So he was outed as, and by the way, just the name like Oswald de Winter is like the most ridiculous like spy name that I could ever imagine.
Actually, I read some interesting things because, he of course was his work was on Shakespeare, and he wrote like an influential book on Shakespeare's influence in Europe. And people had speculated that his pseudonym, Mr. Racine, was a reference to the French playwright Racine, who was like in correspondence with Shakespeare and, was also a very major influential figure in the European theater, and definitely like one of the biggest French playwrights of the Renaissance, that period. But he actually later indicated that the name was a reference to Stenka Racine, who is a sort of Cossack, he's kind of gained this sort of mythological status. He was like a 17th century Cossack who he led some raids against the Tsarist regime, but then he was captured, and in exchange for amnesty he was given he took an oath of allegiance, but then he ended up betraying them, and he led an army of in an attempt to overthrow the government, and then he was finally captured and executed. There's an interesting opera by Alexander Glazunov from the late 19th century. And in this story, Racine has a mistress who is a captured Persian princess. And they're, on a boat on the river Volga. And the princess relates an ominous dream, warning of imminent disaster and her own death in the river. They're suddenly surrounded by Tsarist soldiers, and Racine casts the princess into the water, declaring, "Never in all my 30 years have I offered a sacrifice to the Volga. Today I will give it what is, for me, the most precious of all the world's treasures." And then, his Cossacks try to attack the Russian troops, but he then tries to use the fact that, he killed the princess to suggest, that, he actually had loyalty to the Tsar, try to kind of, get out of it. So he's, this really like conscienceless sort of double agent. And it's like, yeah, and it's so this is the kind of the guy who he was named after. Here's a chilling image from another a poem about the execution of Stempa Razin that's from later in the 20th century, but at the end, after the execution, the crowd falls silent, and Razin's head, still living, laughs his triumph over the watching czar. So this is like, sort of self-image, or the kind of virtual self of Oswald the Winter.
This is his avatar.
Please keep your distance. The trail is to here. There's blood on your finger, brought on by fear. I can't pay for nothing. I worked hard for this. I try to get to you. You treat me like this. It's just second nature. It's what we've been shown. We're living by your rules. That's all that we know.
It's interesting because then a lot of news stories start coming out. Like Abby Hoffman co-writes an investigative piece in Playboy in October 1988. People from the New York Times are able to confirm that there was an earlier 1980 meeting at the L'Enfant Plaza Hotel in Washington between Richard Allen and then two guys named Lawrence Silberman and Robert McFarlane, who would become Reagan's third national security advisor and was pled guilty in the Iran-Contra scandal years later, but at the time was working for Senator John Tower. And that they met with a mysterious Iranian emissary at that hotel over the summer, and that person proposed an idea of like hostage release, but they were just shocked that such a thing would be proposed. And it's like reading Richard Allen. He has like the most venomous interview with Robert Perry in his book, where they try to ask him about this meeting. And he like opens up the TV when they start filming him. He's like, I want to declare that like I am giving my consent to be recorded by WGBH Boston PBS Frontline, aka the KGB, aka Radio Free Moscow, and like accuses them of being communists, and then basically keeps saying like, I'm sorry you're too stupid to understand. I'm sorry you can't wrap your head around like what we had to do to try to get the hostages out, and like blah blah blah. And basically says like he claims that either he or Lawrence Silberman like kind of stood up to this Iranian and said, "Sir, like we have one president at a time in this country. That's not how things work, and you can just get lost." And it's like, okay, all right, guys, that sounds very and that they insisted upon meeting in the lobby of the hotel, so there would be no intimation of impropriety or sneaky business. But then Robert Perry asks him like, well, then why didn't you write a memorandum and like inform the Carter administration that you had been approached by this? And he's just like, you're just too stupid, aren't you? Like, you just don't get it. Like kind of things like that. And so he's a very sketchy, but going back to Oswald the Winter, after journalists started digging into his allegations on the radio show, they quickly discovered that on the date that he said he was in the hotel with Bush and Casey and Richard Allen, that Richard Allen had actually been appearing on Meet the Press at that very time, like on that day. So therefore, he, his credibility was basically completely shredded once people found this like easily available piece of evidence to refute his story, and thus the Washington Press Corps basically turned against the entire October surprise narrative and like deep sixed it, and Bush was elected president in 1988, and basically nobody, It was considered, cranky to basically bring it up after 1988. But there were other whistleblowers too that kept coming out at the time, and these were some of the more kind of shady, mysterious arms dealer kind of figures. Do we want to talk about some of those guys?
Yeah, I was going to say that it was in a way the opposite of Russiagate. It's similar in some ways, but it's also opposite because it's almost everyone wanted to believe Russiagate, or at least a lot of people did. Whereas, like, with this, like, no one wanted to. Everyone wanted to, like, embrace, Reagan as, like, this, the way that he's portrayed in your high school textbook, So it's interesting, like, to think of one as a recursion of the other, but, like, in a very different context. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, the liberal media did not did not.
Well, no one
shine.
wanted to be a liberal at all. Like, it was in 1980. Like, that's so gauche.
It was kind of gauche and not cool, and
not cool at all.
Yeah, the sort of cultural transformation of the 80s definitely didn't help with It I don't know. It just wasn't. There was a lot of pressure, and it does seem to be in this Reagan Bush era.
It's a way of being negative about America, just like when Carter told people to put on a sweater.
Put on a sweater.
When you tell people to put on a sweater, it's the same. If you say that there was a massive conspiracy to, manipulate the election narrative, or provide arms to Iran in exchange.
Yeah,
for all sorts of
even
things.
though Robert Perry points out that this is like the same Republican Party that in 1968, I believe Nixon and Kissinger secretly approached the South Vietnamese government and told them to not sign a peace agreement with the North Vietnamese before the election because they could get them a better deal.
Yeah.
And so that prevented LBJ and Humphrey from signing something, which then narrowly tilted. That's something that maybe could have moved the needle and prevented Nixon from winning. And then, of course, Watergate, the ultimate limited hangout, lot to dig through with that. But the central premise of Republicans doing dirty tricks to undermine their opponent and sort of cheat around the margins and win was there in the early 70s, and then we have 1980. So it's almost like, okay, this is this has been like an ongoing trend, but for some reason the Washington Press Corps, I guess they were too busy patting themselves on the back for Watergate that they just thought that they had solved corruption or something, and that such a thing would never happen again. And they were probably very wrong about that. Around that time, I think another person maybe to mention, I didn't get access to his book, but this guy also wrote a book called October Surprise, I think in 1991, and that was Captain Gary Sick, who is a naval intelligence officer who was working on Carter's National Security Council as their kind of Iran expert in the late 70s. And he initially denied any kind of he basically poo-pooed any idea of some weird things going on with the October Surprise for about 8 years. But then after Iran-Contra came out, was partially exposed, he basically started looking into the Reagan administration's relationship with Iran and traced the Iran-Contra weapons deals backwards in time, and then eventually came to be convinced that the fountainhead of the Reagan team's association with Iran was found during the 1980 campaign, and then kind of went out and was public, went on TV and released this book about it in 1991, and he might have even been being duped because I think it's Barbara Honegger that mentions that Gary Sick was in 1980. He was regularly briefing Herbert Cohen of the Hoover Institution at Stanford, like we mentioned, and Herbert Cohen was friends with Bill Casey and Prescott Bush, who is George H.W. Bush's brother. And he also regularly briefed Donald Gregg, who was a career CIA officer, former station chief of Saigon during the Vietnam War, and somebody who was involved with the Phoenix program, and then went on to be Vice President Bush's national security advisor in the late 80s. And he was Sick was also briefing Paul Hens, who was also on Carter's National Security Council, but was also leaking stuff to the Reagan-Bush campaign the whole time. So he might have even been getting plied for information in a way that he thought was not suspicious back in 1980, and then realized later that all these Republicans, I think he was kind of a career military government guy who believed in the American system and kind of had no real appetite for paranoia or thinking about nefarious deeds happening. But by the early 90s, basically said, like, now I believe this is true, and it makes me very sad. He eventually had to deal, but his things kind of, he was probably one of the only people that had like a sterling reputation that came out and exposed things about this. Almost everybody else was a very shady international arms dealer of some kind, and who would claim to have intelligence ties, but then of course like their respective agencies would always denounce them. But there were a couple of them, including one who Lewinter mentioned in his KFI radio call, which is a guy named Richard Brennicky, who became another whistleblower about Iran-Contra. He comes up in the PBS Frontline thing. They interviewed him, and he's like a very weird, colorful character, like this kind of like scrawny, big glasses, like mustache, like cigar smoking dude. Who claimed to be a CIA contract agent and was an international arms dealer, who claimed to be present. He actually claimed this in court. This is a very strange incident that Robert Perry describes. He'd gone to Denver to testify on behalf of his friend, who is a German pilot named Heinrich Rupp, who just so happened to have been a young Luftwaffe pilot at the end of World War II, and according to Perry, remained a quote admirer of Hitler well into the 1980s, and was also claimed to be a CIA contract pilot, who actually later on personally would claim that he flew the plane that carried Bill Casey to Paris for this meeting. But before we get to all that, in the late 80s, he was charged in some kind of bank fraud crime. And so his defense called Richard Brennicky to come into court to, testify on his character. And in the course of that testimony, he claimed that Heinrich Rupp and him had both gone to Paris in 1980. I guess when Rupp's CIA employment was challenged, he said, well, no, like we went to Paris in 1980 and we were witness to Donald Gregg, George H.W. Bush, and William Casey meeting with Iranians to like delay the hostages after the election. And so the prosecutor in that, I think it was either the prosecutor or maybe the judge. I think it was actually the judge, basically was so kind of offended by that he charged Brennicky with perjury. Wow. I think in a federal court, and basically said, on 5 counts of perjury, said that you're lying about the president and the vice president, and that's wow. You see that also in like the Franklin scandal, when they slammed all these like teenage kids with perjury for supposedly lying about the Larry King sex abuse ring, and like Alicia Owen got like 23 years in prison for perjury. It seems to be, I don't know, like maybe like a George H.W. Bush Justice Department common tactic in the late 80s that was used a lot. But in this case, it actually backfired, because the case, which the prosecutor thought was like an absolute slam dunk, he actually called Donald Gregg in to testify, and he thought this would be like a star witness, because Donald Gregg is like this sort of handsome, respectable CIA expert. But then the defense attorney starts like basically making him explain that like, so you like have to lie to people as part of your profession, right? And he's like, well, yeah. He's like, if you're in Japan and somebody asks you like, who do you work for? Are you going to tell them you work for the CIA? And he's like, no. And he's like, so you lie to people for a living? He's like, well, I guess if you put it that way. And they also the prosecutor tried to get Secret Service records and flight records for George H.W. Bush and also for William Casey, and they basically the Secret Service was not able to provide definitive documents that showed that George W. Bush was like, it's like they dropped him at his house in Washington in mid-October one weekend, and then he allegedly went to a country club. But there's no kind of records of that. Also, Donald Gregg's testimony collapsed because he claimed that he had gone to a friend's lake house that weekend in, I think, Delaware. And they basically, so, it was the 80s, so he basically had no receipts or anything to back up that he was actually there during that weekend. But then he provided like a picture of him and his family hanging out, by the lake. And then they brought in like a meteorological expert, the defense did, to basically look up the weather reports for like that part of Delaware that day, and found that there was like a cold spell with clouds and rain that had come in, and basically that there was like a 90% chance that this picture was taken some other time. So basically Brennicky got acquitted by the jury, and like strutted out of the court like chomping on a cigar, saying like, I've been vindicated, and like blah blah blah. And so that gave another breath of life to the October surprise story, because they weren't able to throw the book at this guy and convict him. The jury did not find it convincing. They thought these guys are sus, and it seems like they just said they did not prove anything beyond like there is definitely reasonable doubt with this whole sequence of events. But then Brennicky decided he got a book deal, and he hired a woman to basically co-write his book. And when she was looking through his records, she found a bunch of receipts and financial records from October 1980 that seemed to prove that he wasn't in Paris on the days he said he was in Paris. So then his like book kind of blew up, and then he was discredited all over again. And so it's like it's a constant thing with the October surprise story, is that there's no kind of unimpeachable perfect witness that can say that like they were there, or whose story completely lines up. But there's like striking similarities between a lot of these different kind of whistleblowers in little bits and pieces of what they said.
One of the biggest mysteries seems to be like which Iranians were there. Like that's something that like no one seems to be able to agree on or really like pin down.
I didn't see a lot of names in there for the October meetings in terms of like which representatives. You're right.
Yeah. George Cave is listed at least by Honegger as being one of the people who was there, but I think that is an alias of Oswald the Winter, which he had given her.
Yes.
And Cyrus.
And by the way, Robert Perry, I guess we didn't finish that thread yet, but Robert Perry tracked down Oswald Lewinter, aka Mr. Raisin, in the early 90s, and he was living in Germany at the time, and they got a video interview with him where he basically admits, like, I was hired by 4 intelligence operatives to launch a disinformation campaign in the summer of 1988 to basically call into a radio show and popularize a version of the October surprise story that had just enough false information in it that it would discredit the whole thing. And that's exactly what I did. And I think he got paid like $10,000 for it or something like that. And so it's like that, then you go back and read Barbara Honegger's book, and he's a huge source of hers. Yeah. And she's kind of taking him at face value. So that kind of makes it throws some of the stuff in her book a little into contention.
Yes. But I think that because like her book is definitely like the more wild one. Like one of my favorite things that she promotes is this idea that John Hinckley Jr., again, like part of her sort of weird reverence for Reagan despite all of this, is the idea that John Hinckley Jr. was a member of an Islamic guerrilla army, which was sort of like being run by Iran in the United States, which I guess was a report that came out in the time in some tabloid. Like, she doesn't really even mention the sort of mainstream narrative of John Hinckley Jr. as being like a mentally ill person who thought that he could impress Jodie Foster by doing this, kind of in an imitation of the movie Taxi Driver.
Which honestly sounds very like MK to me.
Yeah,
like they strapped him in a chair and like Clockwork Orange, like made him watch Taxi Driver and like flashed him images of Jodie Foster until I don't know, just like but that's the vibe I get more than he was a secret Islamic fundamentalist.
Right. She writes, in the investigative reporter, columnist Jack Anderson revealed, like, to use the verb revealed in this context anyway, that assassin John Hinckley had been associated with a U.S.-based faction of the Khomeini-loyal Islamic Guerrilla Army. Anderson's informant, a former Islamic Guerrilla Army member named Tony Rollini, which is a hilarious name had reportedly told the Secret Service 2 months before the shooting, only about 10 days after Reagan's inauguration, that Hinckley was planning to kill the president and had been arrested in Nashville, Tennessee for illegally possessing firearms. Rollini also said that the Islamic Guerrilla Army referred to Hinckley as Hicks. That's just like kind of the stuff that is in there. But because there's so much kind of wacky stuff in there, she also has some of the juicier, more interesting kind of reaches.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big things is the Propaganda Due connection, or the P2 connection.
want to talk about that a little bit, because Robert Perry, I there are parts of the book that I skimmed, but I didn't see that come up as a major thing in his book, which I feel is maybe a lost opportunity, because Propaganda Due was like so involved in both Operation Gladio and the Iran-Contra scandal later on, so it's not surprising that they were somehow in the mix during this, October surprise thing.
The rundown that she gives, basically, I think she does a good job of sort of explaining what this is as well. It's Rapagrupamento Gelli, Propaganda Due, or P2 for short, is the name of a secret illegal Masonic lodge founded in Italy in 1966 by a rich Italian textile merchant named Licio Gelli. Gelli, who was the first Italian ever to be granted joint Italian-Argentine citizenship, was an ardent member and liaison officer to Hitler's Waffen-SS in World War II.
He was.
After overseeing the triumphant return of President Juan Perón to Argentina, Gelli returned to Italy and joined the Italian Secret Service in 1956. In 1972, he became Argentina's economic advisor to Italy, arranging for the purchase of large quantities of arms by his adopted homeland. With the founding of P2 in the late 1960s, Gelli began consolidating power by extracting official secrets from influential Italians as the price of entry to his secret society. These secrets were the ammunition he needed to blackmail additional leaders in Italy's government, military, police, intelligence community, media, business, mafia, and the Vatican to join his organization. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, with the active support and encouragement of CIA headquarters in Rome, P2 began plotting the overthrow of the Italian government from the inside and its replacement by a right-wing fascist dictatorship. Around the same time, P2 began using violence to achieve its ends. On December 12, 1962, bombs since traced to Gelli's secret organization first went off in Rome and Milan. Italian authorities identified the group responsible for these active measures intended to frighten voters into voluntarily calling for a right-wing takeover as an elite P2 cell called the Rows of 20. So this is all pretty much true. Like, this is all like basically agreed upon history. Like that.
It's been outlined in multiple books, so she is getting decent information there.
This is all like totally above board. Like, everyone agrees that this stuff actually did happen involving P2 and these like terrorist activities.
Exactly. And it's also worth she does mention here on page 211 that given the importance of Italy and P2 to the Reagan-Bush administration's secret Iran arms sales, it's not surprising that the CIA's Rome station chief in the early 1980s, Dwayne Dewey Claridge, became a favorite of CIA Director William Casey. Casey later made Claridge co-chairman of Oliver North of the National Security Council's Critical Operations Subgroup, a newly integrated intelligence directorate for counterterrorism policy, where they worked together on the Iran-Contra program. It was Claridge who supervised the drafting of the CIA's now infamous assassination manual for use by the Contras when he was head of the CIA's Latin American Directorate in the mid-1980s, and also oversaw the mining of Nicaragua's harbors, which led to congressional restrictions on military funding to the Nicaraguan resistance. So Dewey Claridge, major sus character, who died 5 or 6 years ago, and actually even has, talk about October surprise, but had a strange connection to the Benghazi attacks in 2012, in that I think the private security company that hired locals to protect the embassy compound were from like a security company run by Dewey Claridge. And he's a pretty dangerous character, but you can see how these big names are all kind of coalescing. I think it is significant that he was Rome station chief in the early 80s.
Well, Honegger does even make some further connections. This is all based on the words of informant Y, who is Oswald de Winter. But so this is what she writes, and she even cites him directly in this text. She says, it was a top member of this illustrious lodge, P2, and the former number 2 man in Italy's military intelligence agency, SISMI, S-I-S-M-I, Francesco Pazienza, with whom Alexander Haig, soon to be Secretary of State, and Michael Ledeen, soon to be Haig's Special Advisor on Italian Affairs at State, reportedly met in early December 1980, 1 month after Ronald Reagan's election victory. Informant Y, who claims to have received his information in an interview with Pazienza, alleges that Haig and Ledeen had both been made honorary non-Italian members of P2, Ledeen in 1980 and Haig sometime before. When the Italian police raided Gelli's home in March 1981, it was Michael Ledeen who, at the instigation of Haig and Henry Kissinger, reportedly offered to buy the list of 953 P2 members in an apparent attempt to keep it from becoming public. Henry Kissinger had also reportedly sent Ledeen to Italy to try to squash an investigation into his and Alexander Haig's involvement in the founding of P2.
Oh my God! Yeah, and the like the Forrest Gump of like CIA covert operations strikes again. Michael Ledeen, I think, we mentioned that he co-wrote a book with General Michael Flynn a few years ago, and is kind of like a psychotic, like anti-Iranian kind of neocon spook operative, and he just pops up like again and again and again in all these different stories. Somebody on the ground. If anybody wants like a little more, we'll do a whole Licio Gelli P2 episode at one point, but I did watch recently, there's a movie starring Rutger Hauer, among others, called The Bankers of God, or I think it's Il Banchieri del Dio. That you might be able to find on like Amazon or something. It's from the 2000s, but it's all about the Vatican bank scandal and the exposing of the P2 Lodge and Roberto Calvi, the banker who was eventually murdered when that scandal exploded. But it has a lot. It ties in with this whole era of like Iran-Contra shenanigans, and the Catholic Church, through the Vatican Bank in particular, which was run by an American archbishop named Paul Marcinkus, who was from Chicago, and they basically were laundering all kinds of money for like mafia intelligence activity, Contra, anti-communist, Gladio stuff, like throughout the early 80s, and I think it's even alluded to in Godfather Part 3, but not very well.
Midnight hour, almost over. Time is running out for the magic ball. I know you get the best that you have, but one more chance couldn't be all that hard to bear. Wait for me, wait for me, oh, I guess that's more than should ask, but won't you wait for me, please wait for me, oh Lord, I know the light is fading fast, you could go either way, is it easier to stay, I wonder what you'll do when your chance rolls around, but you gotta know how much
This plugs in pretty neatly with all kinds of other scandals that were going on, including, like we said, like trading, secretly selling Iran arms, which also, like, I don't know if we mentioned it already, but the whole idea of Iran needing weapons, so they turned to a very unlikely partner in that, which was Israel, which, of course, the Ayatollah Khomeini and, like, the clerics were very against Israel. They were the little Satan under the great Satan, which is correct geopolitically for all these conspiracy people out there that think that, like, the Mossad runs everything. Like, this is actually a good example of how Israel actually does work and, like, the role they play, where they are basically looking after their own interests in the region. So even though they view the overthrow of the Shah as a loss of a great ally, and, a big national security threat for them, their more immediate threat is Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Yeah. And they're aware that Saddam Hussein has his eye on Iran, and he might start a military conflict with them. So even though they have this kind of ideological conflict with the new Iranian regime, when Iran came to some of their contacts in Israel and said, hey, do you think, there's this American embargo on us under Carter. Do you think you can get us, wheels for, like, tires for our F-4s, or certain kinds of small arms and weapons and things that we need to, like, run our Air Force and our military? And I guess the Israeli government under Begin, right? Who was a very hardline Likud president, who, very aggressively defended like Israel's kind of standing in like that region, and was really primarily concerned with like Arabs. And so he saw that Persians, Iranians, basically, even if they're Islamic, you know, they're very anti-Israel and they're Islamic, like maybe there's some room to work with them because at least they're better than Saddam Hussein, who's like also very vocally, you know, both Arab and anti-Israel, etc. So right. they start this kind of setting up these kind of side deals where they can kind of resupply them. And this again, like regardless of, this probably was part of whatever was agreed to in the October surprise meetings, but it definitely was going on throughout the early 80s, where you had Israel covertly supporting Iran, and thus also the U.S. was covertly, once these deals happened in October of 1980, they were also covertly supporting Iran. And then a little bit later in the 80s, the U.S. started covertly supporting Iraq. Right. You know, there's that famous picture of Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein, and I think we actually sold them chemical weapons in the 80s.
Yeah, and Abul Hassan Bani Sadr would like heavily promote that idea that which is a true idea, but that was something that he would also make a big point about, that the United States had supported Iraq. He would even say that Brzezinski had conspired with Saddam to plan the whole invasion of Iran in 1980.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And did Brzezinski think that would like redound to Carter's benefit?
I don't know what his actual idea about that was. It's from his book, which I haven't read, My Turn to Speak, which is where he kind of alleges this. He alleges something else, too, which is that Henry Kissinger wanted to set up a Palestinian state in the Iranian province of Khuzestan, which is on the Iran-Iraq border.
Yeah, that was the oil-rich province we referenced earlier.
Yeah. I was wondering if that was the same one, but
it was.
Yes. Anyway, yeah, so who can really say, but yeah. So
well, I think maybe another big character in terms of somebody who comes out in the late 80s and starts talking smack is another, or claiming the October surprise was real, is another very colorful, interesting character who's like heavily involved in almost everything you could imagine in the 80s in terms of like Western covert ops, which is Ari Ben Menashe.
Mm-hmm.
And he is interviewed in the PBS Frontline thing, and is basically, I think I saw somebody say recently that Ari Ben Menashe had some connection even to like Epstein. And though I don't know if that's another like, oh, it's just Mossad kind of thing, but he definitely was heavily involved in being a middleman arms dealer for Iran-Contra, and specifically I think for the Iran-U.S. covert weapons pipeline that was happening in the 80s. And it was sort of fought over for years, but he basically was an Israeli spy who worked for a department of military intelligence in Israel. So he wasn't in the Mossad necessarily, but this is like a very secret department. The Israeli commanders came out there. They tried to say for a while that he was just a lowly translator, and he absolutely, he's just making up all these fanciful stories about being involved in all these covert ops. But his wife, who Robert Perry interviewed, did say that, he used to go to Poland all the time in the early 80s, when it was still communist, and somehow finagled buying like thousands of AK-47s from, I don't know, underground private business people or like directly from the military, and that he had invited his wife to Poland once, and like she was sort of a witness to these deals, and he was just like having a great time, like getting drunk with like the gun factory owners who were gonna set up this like business deal for him to get like thousands of AKs that maybe we're going to Iran, maybe going elsewhere. But eventually, I think the Israeli government had to concede that he was a genuine operative and high-level operative who's doing very sensitive stuff. But he got in a lot of hot water in the late 80s. He actually got arrested by U.S. Customs for trying to sell 3 C-130 cargo planes to Iran. and then ended up in jail for a couple of years in the U.S., and Israel kind of disowned him. He actually ended up in the MCC in New York, the same place where Jeffrey Epstein slipped and fell and killed himself.
Oh, yes, right.
Yeah, and also where El Chapo is held. Yeah, he worked for the External Relations Department of the IDF from 1977 to 1987. And he claimed that the ERD had even eclipsed the Mossad standing inside Israeli intelligence. But he's someone who is definitely prone to big talk, and Robert Perry seems very wary of him throughout the whole time. And he's very... he loves speaking these kind of cryptic things and weaving these big stories. And he actually claimed that in 1986 he was instructed. He says in 1986 I was instructed to leak the story of secret White House arms sales to Iran. Conservatives in Israel's intel services put out the arms for hostages story as retaliation for U.S. Customs sting called the Merchants of Death case. In April 1986, Customs had rounded up 17 international arms dealers who were charged with conspiring to supply billions of dollars worth of weapons to the Iranian war machine. One of the indicted was former Israeli Brigadier General Avraham Baram, who had close ties to Israel's Likud party. So he was kind of claiming that, like, I was behind leaking the story, I think to, like, the Lebanese newspaper, which Bob Perry found suspicious because it was Lebanese, but that basically the sort of hardliners, the Likud people, wanted to get back at the U.S. for rounding up a lot of their arms dealers. I can't speak really to if I buy that part 100%, because they were so entangled. I don't know. Maybe there was more to that. But he basically, when Bob Perry asked him about Iran-Contra, he said, quote, "You think you know what happened," the Israeli said with a wry smile, "but you don't understand what really happened." And he also made a kind of explosive claim that this is a name that doesn't necessarily pop up much elsewhere, but he said that the key American official in the early contacts with Iran was Robert Gates of the CIA. And Robert Gates, as we all know, I mean, he went on, I believe, to be first CIA director under George H.W. Bush, and then he was brought back by Bush's son to be the CIA director in the late 2000s, and then was kept on the job by Obama. Or he was also, he might have been defense minister, Secretary of Defense at one of those times as well. But always seen as kind of a straight kind of down the middle, accomplished public servant. And basically, so he was, my bad, he was actually, he became director of Central Intelligence under George H.W. Bush, and was also the acting CIA director when Casey fell ill quickly in 1987. So for like 5 or 6 months, he was in charge of the CIA, like while the Iran-Contra stuff was breaking, and then he became Secretary of Defense, I believe after Rumsfeld left in 2006, and Obama kept him on until 2011. So just a respected bipartisan guy, and I think in 1980 he was working on Carter's, I think like the executive assistant to Admiral Stansfield Turner, who was Carter's CIA director, who was the one who all these right-wing people hate because he fired like 800 people. So he was in a sensitive position actually within basically the Carter administration. I think he was also in on the National Security Council kind of talks about Iran, and given his like sterling career and I don't know, his like bland demeanor and his ability to like survive all these scandals without anything ever basically coming back to haunt him, makes me think, yeah, I could see this guy being involved. But other people have kind of challenged that and said that there's no evidence that like Bob Gates was. He also could have been leaking things to the like Bill Casey and the Republicans, because he is a Republican at the end of the day.
Yes.
But I guess Ben Menashe, I mean, he claimed that in 1981, when Reagan was in office, that then Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, future Prime Minister, and Secretary of State Alexander Haig held secret talks to permit American arms to flow to Iran. And Ben Menashe claimed that this established like this big illegal kind of slush fund arms selling program, and he estimated that total Israeli sales for the 8-year war, which is selling weapons during the Iran-Iraq War, was at $82 billion in sales. He said these deals created a slush fund that he claimed was spread through 24 bank accounts and stood at about $800 million. Much of that largesse filled Likud political coffers and paid for new Jewish housing on the occupied West Bank. That housing, in turn, cemented the settlers' political loyalty to the Likud. So, so that's a cool legacy of the October surprise.
Cool. Yes. Interesting. Yeah. On the other side of the coin, there's like the Vatican connection that also was brought up, kind of related to the P2 connection that Honegger also brought up vis-a-vis like the Knights of Malta. Yeah, it's interesting because like a lot of like this is kind of where she gets into some of the stuff relating to the Kennedy assassination. Probably we'll get more into the possible links to that like in the second part of this Iran-Contra exploration, but she does kind of deal with it vis-a-vis George Bush and his kind of what she calls like Operation White Rose and all these things. But yeah, she writes that Licio Gelli himself, Michael Sedona, Alexander Haig, Reagan Bush campaign manager William Casey, and former CIA Beirut Station Chief William Buckley were all also reportedly members of the Vatican's military order, the Knights of Malta.
I've heard that. I know Bill Casey absolutely was. I've heard that George H.W. Bush was as well.
Yeah. So, given that Knights of Malta member William Casey, Knights of Malta associate Cyrus Hashemi, and representative P2 linked Ayatollah Beheshti of Iran, and a representative of P2 member Alexander Haig reportedly met together on or around October 19th and 20th, 1980, at a hotel named Raphael, it may be more than coincidental that the residence of Italy's Prime Minister, Bettino Craxi, himself reportedly a right-hand man of Gelli's, is on the top floor of the Hotel Raphael in Rome. Although former Iranian President Abul Hassan Bani Sadr has reported that he believes the Reagan-Bush campaign and Iranian representatives met at the Raphael Hotel in Paris, France, it is possible that Mr. Bani Sadr incorrectly assumed that the Hotel Raphael referred to by his sources in Iran was the one in Paris, where he was newly exiled. Given Prime Minister Craxi's close association with Michael Ledeen and Ledeen's close association with both William Casey and Secretary of State Alexander Haig, who appointed him liaison to Craxi at the Department of State, it is possible that the Raphael suite, where the secret pre-election meeting reportedly took place, was in fact the Raphael Hotel in Rome. When the White House needed to contact Craxi in October 1985 in an attempt to intercept the jetliner carrying the hijackers of the Achille Lauro cruise ship, Oliver North asked Ledeen to call the Italian Prime Minister at his residence at the Raphael Hotel in Rome. According to Ledeen, Italy's military intelligence service, SISMI, many of whose top officers had belonged to Gelli's organization P2, knew about William Casey's secret initiative to Iran. The CIA's Rome station chief in 1981, Dwayne Dewey Claridge, became a favorite of the new CIA director, and the agency's Rome headquarters reportedly facilitated secret arms shipments to Iran from Italian ports beginning in the early 1980s. According to the Greek newspaper Dimokratikos Logos, Alexander Haig's associate Robert McFarlane was tape recorded reminding Iranian officials during his late May 1986 trip to Iran, the one with the now infamous cake, that by then Iran had already received $1.3 billion in U.S. arms. Given Haig and Casey's reported membership in the Vatican's military order, the Knights of Malta, and the Vatican's links to Gelli's P2 through Michel Sedona and others, it may be more than a coincidence that the amount of money reportedly involved in the Banco Ambrosiano Vatican bank scandal was almost precisely the same figure, $1.4 billion, according to informant Y. Again, that's Oswald de Winter. Some of this $1.4 billion was laundered through bank accounts in Panama, where the Panamanian general Manuel Noriega has access to records demonstrating this connection. If true, this may explain Noriega's boast that he had information which, if revealed, could substantially affect Vice President Bush's chances in the 1988 presidential election.
Yes, and I'm sure had nothing to do with Bush's decision to invade Panama and storm his palace and steal all of his papers.
It was secret information on the Vatican connection. But yeah, so she goes on to talk a little bit more about that vis-a-vis, again, informant Y. But she says that his source is, or he says his source is Francesco Pazienza, who is Licio Gelli's top associate. George Bush is himself an honorary member of P2. And he became he became director of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1976. Although the author has no confirmation for this claim, it is a fact that Gelli's lodge, especially P2's sister, Monte Carlo Comite, has branches in many countries besides Italy, and that the Grand Master's key targets for membership have been top civilian and military intelligence officials. Well, but anyway.
Including, of course, future, ridiculous strongman of Italy, Silvio Berlusconi,
right?
Who, as a media executive or media owner in the 80s, was a member of this lodge.
Yes.
And also worth mentioning that Licio Gelli was basically like an exalted guest of honor at Reagan's first inauguration. Yeah, so I mean, this is Licio, I was born a fascist, I will die a fascist, Gelli, who's
I
young.
love how Italians are always saying things like that, just claiming how fascist they are, like, I'm 200% fascist, or things like...
Exactly. I mean, somebody whose, young biography is basically depicted in Solo, 120 Days of Sodom, is, hanging out with George Bush and Ronald Reagan, and, George Bush, the idea of him being a member of this kind of crypto-fascist Masonic lodge really makes you wonder what's going on behind that calm exterior.
Yeah, well, she going deeper on the Bush connection, she writes that or Honegger writes that George Bush's code name for the secret Iran operation was White Rose. So she takes this very far, saying the reader will recall that the Rose of 20 was the code name for the control cell responsible for terrorism in Italy. So she draws a connection there with the Rose. Informant Y said that Gelli was behind removing the Shah of Iran from power, but he wanted Savak officers who had joined P2 and who were therefore under his control to stay on as part of Savama, Khomeini's new secret police. But anyway, so... she says that there are two further references to the White Rose that should be noted. Although they have no known relationship to the Reagan-Bush administration's secret Iran initiative, White Rose was the name of a radical right-wing pro-Batista group of anti-Castro Cubans based in Miami in the early 1960s at the time of the CIA Bay of Pigs operation. A source who worked in the agency in the early 1960s told The Nation that George Bush was involved in the Caribbean. There was very definite worry that some Cuban American groups were going to move against Castro and attempt to blame it on the CIA. Okay.
Interesting. Well, yeah, he has been rumored to have been working for the CIA, at least in a kind of non-official capacity, with his Zapata offshore oil company that was just off the coast of Cuba, and then maybe with the JM Wave station in Miami, which is the huge CIA station that I think was run by Ted Shackley, who ended up, being a close friend and advisor to CIA Director Bush. I guess they never ran into each other and they just happened to become best friends. And of course, Felix Rodriguez, who we're probably going to spend a lot of time on in the next Iran-Contra episode, who was a close personal friend of Donald Gregg and George Bush, and allegedly used to keep the embalmed hand of Che Guevara, who he personally helped track down and murder. I think in Bolivia in 1967.
That's very...
he definitely had his watch. He wore Che Guevara's watch as a trophy, and was involved in the Phoenix program, etc. So
that's very Hand of Saint Teresa, very, very Franco.
It is. It really is.
Her other connections to the White Rose. Well, there's two connections. The first one is very classic conspiracy theory, where she says the White Rose is also the symbol of the British Royal House of York, which fought the War of the Roses against the House of Lancaster, whose symbol was the Red Rose in England. President George Bush is related to English royalty, so that's obviously just your standard fare kind of royal bloodline discussion.
Yeah.
But there's another one where she's sort of speculating, if George Bush was in the P2, then Licio Gelli would probably have some kind of blackmail on him, because that was part of the initiation, as she describes it.
Interesting. So, what kind of blackmail?
What could it possibly be? There could be a memo written by Bush in 1963, when Bush was already reportedly a CIA agent or asset, The Nation has obtained one such document from this period, a memo from then FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover recounting the 1963 briefing given to then CIA Representative George Bush following President Kennedy's murder. Vice President Bush's White House office denied that he had ever been a CIA agent or asset, and claimed that the George Bush in the memo obtained by the Nation therefore referred to another George Bush. However, the publication then contacted this other George Bush, who insisted that it could not have been he who was referred to in the memo. The Nation also reported that another former CIA employee had confirmed the accuracy of its original claim. One of George Bush's first actions as director of the CIA in 1976 was to squelch an investigation by the Senate Committee on Intelligence into the CIA's involvement in the Kennedy assassination. Interesting thing to squelch.
I mean, I could get really spun off on details of like what was George Bush doing on November 22nd, 1963, and it's very that memo was actually uncovered in 1988 while during the presidential campaign, and they did all this kind of hemming and hawing about how it was like this other George Bush, and it's not convincing. Like their kind of alibi for it, and he was in Dallas the night before for an oil conference. And
interesting.
Well,
to close this loop here quickly, on the 25th anniversary of his brother's death, Senator Edward Kennedy paid his respect by placing a single white rose at the foot of President Kennedy's memorial in Runnymede, England. This act, of course, may be purely coincidental, but then again, it may not. So that's her sort of white rose weaving in with George W. Bush. Again, like kind of the weird, like sort of symbological free association tone of Honegger's book, but an interesting part nonetheless.
I think maybe the last character that maybe I want to discuss a little bit, and this isn't exhaustive in terms of everybody who is involved, but I think this is a person that's kind of an interesting window into this whole network, is a gentleman named Count Alexandre de Marenches, who at the time was the head of the French intelligence service, the DGESE, and was a close personal friend of William Casey. And Robert Perry talks about him quite a bit in his book as somebody who basically would have had the means, motive, and opportunity to help broker and set up some of these secret meetings, down to the level of like providing security and, discreet ways of getting in and out of the country for people like Casey or Bush or Donald Gregg. But as I just said, he was a count and like an old kind of old money, high society Frenchman who was virulently anti-communist and I guess pro what he would call Western civilization, and was a similar mind to Bill Casey in terms of being very concerned about Soviet encroachment. And like we said before, like a lot of the technocrats were kind of poo-pooing the idea that either that the Soviet Union would collapse on its own accord. They certainly didn't think that, but also that we should go to extraordinary measures to make them collapse. But de Marenches was definitely on that tip. So he definitely had some meetings earlier in 1980 with Bill Casey. But I just wanted to read a little passage from Trick or Treason, and basically that sort of sketches out his worldview and maybe is a sort of omen of things that would come later in the 1980s when Reagan won. I guess I'll start here that in de Marenches' book, The Fourth World War, creepy, de Marenches cited the, quote, code of silence that a senior intelligence official accepts. Quote, "It is as profound as any blood fealty sworn by a tribal chieftain," he said. "The knowledge and power wielded by those in my chosen profession are accompanied by a need to guard our crown jewels in the most profound secrecy." In the book, de Marenches gave the reader a glimpse of a few jewels, but always in settings favorable to conservative causes. He described his post-election meeting with Reagan in California when the spy chief lectured the president-elect about the coming apocalypse. De Marenches said he warned Reagan, an interested student, about the growing dangers of international communism and third world terrorism. At another session after Reagan entered the White House, de Marenches stressed the need for a bold and imaginative action to protect Western interests. He then outlined a plan dubbed Operation Mosquito, which involved a joint U.S.-French covert action to smuggle drugs into Afghanistan to addict the Soviet soldiers. Quote, "If this works, you will upset the Russians," de Marenches said. He told the president, "There will be considerable pressure on them to pack up and go home and to avoid moral and physical disintegration." The French spy master said an enthusiastic Reagan quickly reached for the secure phone to call Casey. De Marenches wrote that Casey then asked the French spy chief to undertake the drug operation. With discreet White House backing, Operation Mosquito was put in place but ultimately was dropped for fear of public disclosure, de Marenches said. Okay, likely story. Still, in their commitment to aggressive covert operations against the Soviets, Casey, Reagan, and de Marenches appeared to have been of like minds. In his book, de Marenches also praised President Bush for his work at the CIA in 1966-77 and for his understanding that intelligence operations must be performed with utmost secrecy. In an early meeting with Bush in 1976, de Marenches proposed, quote, "some joint system of cooperation with the Americans, similar to the loose working arrangements we had with our European allies." Bush was sympathetic but cautious, de Marenches noted. Now, I think that's interesting because there was something that I think maybe we'll get to at a later date called the Safari Club that was inaugurated while Bush was CIA director that involved, I believe, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Pakistan, and notably France and the United States to create a sort of loose network, a joint system of cooperation.
And Iran.
And Iran, you're right, because this was before the Iranian Revolution. So the Safari Club was already in existence. Of course, Bush got drummed out of the CIA when Carter and Stansfield Turner came in. But one of the subtexts of that is that there were 800 or so pissed off career CIA people that had just been laid off and a CIA director that had just been laid off. And the kind of foundation for what would become Iran-Contra in the 80s was sort of laid out throughout the late 70s and the Carter administration in a very kind of loose, informal kind of way. And perhaps you could look at the October surprise of 1980 as one of the first big operations to kind of get back in the driver's seat and retake power in the most powerful Western country, and then it was kind of off to the races after that. So I think it's so typical. Everyone always describes Bush was sympathetic but cautious, so I'm sure de Marenches is protecting his friend. He actually said in 1992, Robert Perry recounts in, I think, the final chapter, that de Marenches I think he did lend credence to Bill Casey being involved in some kind of October surprise negotiation, but he strongly denied that Bush had anything to do with it. But in 1992, at like a book signing, he refused to answer any questions about the October surprise because he said he, quote, like, didn't want to hurt my good friend George Bush. So people were kind of scratching their heads a little bit, like, well, if he had nothing to do with it, then why we're talking about it? Maybe he just meant that, you know, these rumors would get dredged up, but it definitely seems like this guy is like a very top player. And
yeah, I mean, he was the one who really organized the Safari Club to begin with, was de Marenches, and he actually came up with the name, which makes sense for someone who's French, very French thing to be super
safari,
into sort of safaris.
Club,
La Kanga, les éléphants.
Actually, the original charter, you're right. Like, he initiated the pact, and the first 5 countries were France, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Morocco, and Iran. And the charter begins, recent events in Angola and other parts of Africa have demonstrated the continent's role as a theater for revolutionary wars prompted and conducted by the Soviet Union, which utilizes individuals or organizations sympathetic to or controlled by Marxist ideology. Good.
Yeah. And he spoke fluent American English because his mother was American, so he had like clear, very strong ties to the United States. Yeah.
And of course, I'm just going through the Safari Club. I actually I knew he was involved in it. I wasn't aware that he was like the main mover and shaker of this. So it's funny that he steers very far clear of mentioning the Safari Club when he talks to Robert Perry. But the Safari Club takes its name after the exclusive resort in Kenya, where the group first met in 1976. The club was operated by who else? Saudi arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi. And of course, Adnan Khashoggi is going to come up big time in Iran-Contra. He was also a good friend, a mover and shaker in the 1980s with a certain President Trump, who bought Khashoggi's yacht in the late 80s. I think we mentioned that before. And also important to note that the creation of the Safari Club coincided with the consolidation of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, which served to launder money, particularly for Saudi Arabia and the United States. And the CIA director in 1976, George H.W. Bush, had a personal account at BCCI. And there's a quote here. It says, the Safari Club needed a network of banks to finance its intelligence operations. With the official blessing of George Bush as head of the CIA, Adham transformed a small Pakistani merchant bank, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, into a worldwide money laundering machine, buying banks around the world in order to create the biggest clandestine money network in history. This is I think it was the Bank of Crooks and Criminals International was the joke title of it. Really critical to Iran-Contra's, all of the Iran-Contra operations, and was tied in with financing kind of terrorism, first of the sort of the Arab Afghan variety, Mujahideen, but then later elsewhere, people like Licio Gelli and P2, the Central American death squads, drug trafficking, all of this stuff. So I think it's really interesting that Mr. Safari Club de Marenches came up with this idea in 1981 called Operation Mosquito, which was specifically, consciously, to flood an area filled with an enemy population and to get them addicted to drugs to undermine their discipline and community, because it just seems strangely similar to the flooding of crack cocaine onto the streets of every major black neighborhood in every city in the United States.
That's a good point.
In the 1980s, and to unleash drugs. I mean, it's not a new concept. You go back to the Opium Wars, the idea of weaponizing drugs to kind of undermine a specific population that you want to subjugate. But it's interesting that Reagan was so was beaming, jumped for the phone to call Casey to tell him about this great idea to hook Soviet soldiers on. It's kind of weird they wanted to import drugs because Afghanistan was one of the largest opium, manufacturers in the entire world.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing as well. This is from a WAPO article from 1984. which is entitled USIA, and the information agency is urged to call USSR Soviet Empire. Charles Z. Wick, the irrepressible director of the U.S. Information Agency, was discussing high strategy the other day with his number 2 man, Leslie Lanowski, and the former head of French intelligence, Count Alexandre de Marenches. It was a most solemn session, dully chronicled in a 17-page transcript intended for official eyes only. Putting first things first, de Marenches brought up the Soviet Union. It should not be called the Soviet Union, he said. He told Wick the USIA should always say Soviet Empire. Then the problem came up of what to call the Soviet defense minister, Dmitri Ustinov. I don't like the word defense when you're talking about the Russians, said de Marenches. Minister of War, Wick asked. I was going to say that he would be called the Minister of War, Minister of Global Aggression, the Count suggested. That is what he really is. Speaking of war, he reminded the USIA policymakers that their agency is responsible for the war of ideas. Declared de Marenches, I would say that we haven't lost the war of ideas. We haven't even fought it. Now, what this kind of warfare tells us, don't worry too much about hitting the body. Go in through the eyes and the ears. But the best place to hit the Poles, he said, was in the stomach. The USIA should bear down on Poland's food problems, he said. Lack of food should be associated with communist ideas, something that we still see today. De Marenches urged, I think simple things like this, Charles, are absolutely of paramount importance. And if we don't do this, why do the rest? This is absolutely, I think, vital. Do you agree? Lanowski quickly agreed. I think you are absolutely right, he said. Wick later made a comment which can only be classified as mystifying. I think you can, without bilaterals, be provocative, he said. De Marenches got back to nomenclature. The Voice of America's name should be changed, he said. I am not sure I would call it the Voice of America. Too late now, interjected an unidentified voice. Undeterred, the Count suggested that the VOA be renamed the Voice of Liberty. Lanowski had something to say about the nature of the Soviet adversary. I had a friend who said whenever you want to evaluate a Russian behavior, you need not only a chess expert, but a magician, a functional paranoid, etc. All right. Despite the perplexity and perversity of the Soviet Union, despite his dissatisfaction with the U.S. nomenclature, de Marenches said he saw a light on the horizon. One day, he said, they will be Russia again. Unidentified voice. You mean the historical Russia? De Marenches, the power will break. Voice, we have got to liberate those people. Let's.
Oh God! Yeah,
yes,
I noticed that. It always triggers me a little bit when throughout the Cold War, particularly these right-wing anti-communist people, like almost pathologically refer to the Soviet Union as Russia and Russians. And it's like, I get it. Like, yeah, they're majority Russian, but like, that's not what their country's called. Like, there's stop erasing like Kazakhs and Ukrainians.
Soviet Empire.
Soviet Empire. That also lines up with a quote from Robert Perry's book, where he says that in kind of meeting with Casey, de Marenches wanted the Western Alliance to enter a crusade against its enemies on, quote, the battlefield of the mind. There, he believed, an enemy could be confused and defeated through stealth and deception rather than through force alone. And yeah, that's exactly what they kind of started to do. I think we see a real explosion of both like hot proxy war and international crime and mind war in the 1980s, which like we'll probably talk in our next, like that is something that actually the Peter Schweitzer book Victory goes into an extreme detail, also putting the pressure on Poland as kind of the most vulnerable point of like the Soviet alliance to basically ratchet up the misery and like basically deny them any kind of economic aid and like try to exacerbate the problems while also spending literally billions of dollars covertly supporting Solidarność. And this was like a huge thing with William Casey, who of course was like a pretty devout Catholic, and he tried to get the Vatican in on this right away, but actually Pope John Paul II, despite being a Polish Catholic himself, only wanted to stick to kind of indirect influence because the church, in an interesting twist, of course you had like the Vatican Bank P2 people who were very, willing to support terrorism and the mafia and stuff, but John Paul II did not want to the church to be seen as antagonizing the situation and trying to escalate it, and they certainly did not want to be associated with the CIA. because, you know, they have a reputation to protect. And it actually, it was after William Casey went to Rome the first time and tried to get an audience with the Pope, but he was instead given an audience with the Vatican's foreign minister, who basically told him at the end of the meeting, was kind of nice to him, but then said, what he asked, like, when will I get to meet the Pope? He said that he's not happening, you know, and basically said, like, you know, it's not going to happen. And then weirdly, maybe just like a month or two after that, a crazy Turkish Grey Wolf assassin shot the Pope in public. And there was all this like disinfo that I think ended up getting believed by the Vatican, that actually the Bulgarian KGB was behind this assassination plot. So then after the Pope had been shot, and this kind of conspiracy theory that the KGB tried to assassinate him gained traction within the Vatican, that is when Pope John Paul basically decided to more closely collaborate with the U.S. government and try to kind of destabilize Poland and provide covert support to Solidarność. And actually, a really interesting twist that I didn't know about, that's in the Victory book that they brag about a lot, is that the main pipeline for getting like top secret radio equipment and other supplies that would have raised suspicion into the country was done through Israeli rat lines in Poland. So actually the Israelis were a critical node in Poland to basically funding and providing covert support to the Solidarność revisionists. So you see the same networks at play here. They're all kind of working on multiple fronts at the same time. And even in ways that you might not, like maybe you would think like the Vatican would be more out front, you know, the Polish Catholic Pope would be leading the charge. But
here's a really interesting article related to what you're talking about, called "Former Spy Says He Warned the Vatican of Assassination Try." This is from the Wall Street Journal on August 8th, 1985. And you'll recognize one of the names here from what we talked about earlier. Well, a few of the names, I guess. With a propensity for being at the scene of impending scandal, Francesco Pazienza recently popped up in the case of the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II on May 1981. So that's Licio Gelli's like right-hand man, according to
Oh, yeah.
At the continuing trial of the Bulgarian officials in Rome, the judge attempted to quiet the courtroom June 19th by shouting "Patience," or in Italian, "Pazienza." At this point, the star prosecution witness, Mehmet Ali Aga, the one-time Turkish neo-Nazi already convicted of shooting the Pope, interjected, "Yes, Francesco Pazienza." Asked to explain, Mr. Agca made headlines here and in Italy by saying that in 1982, Mr. Pazienza had come to him in prison offering freedom if he would implicate the Bulgarians in the crime, as he has. Mr. Pazienza, who had left his job with SISMI, the Italian spy agency, in 1981, says he never met Mr. Agca, but was involved, AGCA, in case anyone wants to look it up, but was involved in the case in other ways involving the spreading of information on terrorism. Ironically, neither of their former SISMI officers face charges that they illegally used SISMI to try and blame right-wing terrorism on leftists.
Yeah, that was like such a common tactic of Licio Gelli and the propaganda due kind of operators, was to do terrorism and then blame it on the Red Brigades or the KGB.
Yeah.
This is like a constant like strategy of tension Gladio thing. And so I wonder, like, to what extent was it influenced? Because, of course, around, like, 1981, 82, you had the Vatican bank scandal, and that Bankers of God movie kind of goes into it in more detail, but you see that there's a real interesting, like, power play going on between Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, played by Rutger Hauer, and some other officials within like the Vatican hierarchy, and he eventually ended up kind of getting like sent back, like kind of fleeing to America to avoid prosecution, and he ended up getting kind of drummed out of the church and all this stuff. But I wonder to what extent was the reluctance of John Paul II to fully commit to like CIA covert operations and like illegal, parapolitical activities, maybe had something to do with a Turkish neo-Nazi taking a shot at him?
Yeah, this article actually gets more interesting because Mr. Pazienza says that as a terrorism expert for SISMI, SISMI, he and his close associate, Alexandre de Marenches, the now retired head of French intelligence, he retired because, the socialist French president who was elected, he appointed, like, a bunch of communists, like, to work in the intelligence agency, so he was, like, he stormed out, but anyway... So he said that he and de Marenches warned the Vatican of an impending Soviet attack on the Pope 6 months before.
Wow.
But
these guys are just they're so good at being spies. They just they felt it in the air, I guess.
So Michael Ledeen Pazienza and Mr. de Marenches and Arnaud de Borchgrave. They became in 1981 the three leading journalistic exponents of the theory that the Soviet Union was responsible for Western European terrorism.
That was I mean, it's amazing. And then you see this repeat throughout the 80s where Cuba and like Nicaragua are fingered as the number one drug traffickers. It's kind of like today when literally every American politician just repeats the bullshit lie that Iran is the number one state sponsor of terrorism in the world. It's just like so objectively not true unless you expand the definition of terrorism to the point that it's meaningless. It's like obviously Saudi Arabia, if you're talking about at least that sort of Islamic quote unquote terrorism, like it's obviously Saudi Arabia, and probably like Qatar is second place, and actually probably the US more than anybody, and maybe the UK and France, like all but it's like such projection.
Again, terrorism doesn't mean anything. Like terrorism is like a meaningless term that is in itself like loaded and like is overdetermined. Like if it just means like the use of violence to like cause fear, like that it's like, of course the US is the largest like sponsor of terrorism. Like if it means targeting civilians, like same thing, like or they're the biggest terrorists. Like there's no real like stable meaning of this. Like it's just a
and
term
I would say
like,
that I mean if we want to
delegitimize violence like as a propaganda technique, like
and if we want to like even stick with a kind of normative definition of terrorism, all the people we've talked about in this episode are literally the biggest terrorists of like the late 20th century and like are kind of like an almost like a mega network of like international terrorists that are kind of pulling the strings. I mean, just to quote de Marenches one more time, he wrote, I think in his book, that I believe in the raison d'etat, which may outweigh any conventional morality. As one of the longest-standing leaders of Western intelligence, I have learned that there are two sorts of history. There is the history we see and hear, the official history, and there is the secret history, the things that happen behind the scenes in the dark that go bump in the night. As a player in the first and a manipulator in the second, I have attempted to bring my work the kind of understanding of both aspects of history. So, like, he's basically telling you right there that he's, well, first of all, that he believes in la raison d'etat might outweigh any conventional morality. So he's already telling you right off the bat that you have to put that aside and may possibly be willing to do some of the worst things imaginable as long basically I mean the ultimate straw man about like communist countries is like they think the end justifies the means. Well what the fuck is this? Like I mean this is like the ultimate ends justifying the means of like we can work with Nazis, we can run pedo rings, we can do drug trafficking, we can target like racist in a racist way, like target populations we don't like, we can flood regions with drugs, we can do tons of white-collar crime and money laundering. We can constantly lie to the people that elected us. It's like the most satanic shit ever, but it is okay because, it's ça va because they're doing it for Western civilization.
Ça va.
Just comme ci, comme ça. What's the big deal?
It's just comme ci, comme ça. But I mean I guess actually like according to Wikipedia, I'm seeing this now on Wikipedia, on the Wikipedia article for de Marenches, but according to this article, his book, The Fourth World War, had like a renaissance among American elites after 9/11 because it was seen as being prescient of the role of terrorism, so people were once again picking it up and saying, oh, he was right all along, So yeah,
all these Bush administration adjacent Nazis could just they could just smell it in the air. They just knew it was coming. Yeah, it's a pretty, I'm willing to believe that all these people, were doing something. It is completely in line with their MO and what they wanted and what they ended up getting. And it's kind of amazing that this would still be poo-pooed, but also not surprising because Bush just had this stranglehold basically on, I don't know. I mean, and de Marenches mentions literally almost like mind war. And I think that that had so much to do with their strategy in the 80s of changing, I think as Don Draper said once, if you don't like what's being said, change the conversation. And they did kind of successfully do that. I just want to mention one other thing we forgot to get to earlier is there's a sub-scandal within the October Surprise or related to the 1980 campaign that was called, at the time, Debategate. And there was actually a congressional investigation into it where basically somebody stole Carter's debate prep book before one of the presidential debates, and it wound up in possession of the Reagan-Bush campaign, and nobody could quite figure out why. Robert Perry's book said that a congressional investigation indicated that it was probably Bill Casey or James Baker III, H.W.'s consigliere, who orchestrated the theft of Carter's debate book. And that's just another thing that's just kind of whatever, it just, what's the big deal? So Reagan went into the debates with Carter knowing all of his points and tactics and what he was going to do. Kind of reminds you of Hillary and Bernie in the primaries. Similar trick. So, I mean, it certainly seems like they were willing to do whatever it took to get themselves into the White House. And then once they got in there, they certainly rearranged a lot of the furniture and put their stamp on the place. And we will dive very deeply into that next week. But maybe now is a good time to sort of wind this up. Is there anything else that you want to mention?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground. We talked about Fire Club, we talked about de Marenches, we talked about Propaganda Due. I think that we even talked about John Hinckley Jr.'s Islamic Guerrilla Army connections. We got
exactly. And he was the real weird thing about John Hinckley was that I think his brother was having dinner with one of George Bush's sons. Not George W., but it was Jonathan Bush maybe, or Neil, either the night before the shooting happened, which means that the Hinckleys and the Bushes knew each other. So the Hinckleys were a wealthy family, and I guess John was just this wayward, wacky, kind of black sheep son maybe. But I mean, who would benefit from Reagan getting shot 1 year into his presidency?
Yeah, true.
I mean, and somebody who might even have a little bit of a track record of getting rid of certain presidents.
Yeah, well, I guess when God shone that light down on him, he was protected from the bullets. So that plot was, I guess, foiled. But
I'm glad we had that nugget of information about Honegger because I've wondered about her for years. She's a name I discovered a long time ago, and she did work with Mae Brussell in the 80s.
Yeah.
She's thanked in her book, but I especially when I started to see her later stuff with insisting that a particle beam weapon is what took down the World Trade Center, and I forget if she's a no-planer or not, but she was in that 9/11 truth mix.
She definitely is.
Some of the more bold and kind of eye-rolling kind of claims that, to her are absolutely you're a limited hangout if you're not talking about directed energy weapons. And still has this reverence for Ronald Reagan, which I think you see a lot on the right with people that have been... I guess maybe it was just inevitable that George H.W. Bush was going to get singled out as a sketch character. But you could still hold that hope for Ronnie, the sacred cowboy. who, you know, just wanted to make America great again. And I am not, though I don't think he was like, you know, involved to the kind of granular level that people like Bill Casey and Donald Gregg or Richard Allen or George Bush were in. He's the kind of guy that when you know, some French spy shows up and tells you about Operation Mosquito to get all the Soviet soldiers addicted to heroin, he like jumps for the phone to call Bill Casey to tell him to do it. So, you know, or just like, hey, Mr. President, should we like do whatever we can to support the Contras? Like, okay. And then, you know, they go off and mine the harbors and, you know, train death squads and bring 1 million tons of cocaine into America. And, you know, who knows? Maybe he was going senile. Maybe it was a kind of, you know, keeping it compartmentalized so you wouldn't have a Nixon repeat where the president knew something. It's hard to say, but I think it's safe to say that, like, I don't know if we should, like, let St. Ronnie off the hook.
Yeah. It's certainly not. I certainly don't think that God approved of Ronald Reagan. That's my take on the issue. I would say no. I do not think that God parted the heavens to bless Ronald Reagan while he was giving his, you know, inaugural address. I'm just gonna go out on a limb and say that. But
maybe the party of God, Hezbollah, was behind it all,
right,
and
of course.
we can blame it all on the swarthy
on those cunning Iranians,
whether it be the cunning Persians or the swarthy Israelis. You know, it was all their doing, and our benighted waspy elites had nothing to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was. Definitely. Her book was very much heavily on the Iranian stuff and some of the, like, you know. Yeah, the swarthier you were, like, the more implicated I think you were in the whole thing. But yeah, although, you know, a lot of those other guys came off badly. But yeah, you know, some of this actually kind of reminded me of, like, the Somerton Man thing. Like, you know, just in terms of, like, the networks. It was, like, that mysterious murder where that dude was found, like, on a beach in, I guess it was the Somerton Park Beach. Which is why he's called that, but, like, he's still an unidentified corpse, and no one knows, like, who he was, and he had, like, a mysterious cutout of a sort of a rare printing of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam in his, like, pocket that just said, like, Tamam Shud, which is, like, you know, finished or ended, like, it is completed. And it's, like, unknown, like, who he was. There's, like, speculation. I mean, this was a while, like, you know, this was a while before any of these events. It was, like, in 1948. Okay. But, like, the weird, like, links with, like, the sort of Persian intelligence and stuff, like, going, like, far back and things like that. It just, some of this, like, you know, made me think of that stuff as, like, it's interesting to think of that, like, through Iran-Contra. It's very, like, you know, distant in time, but it's interesting to consider some of these, like, deep connections, like the ones you know, that were kind of cemented in the Safari Club, and some of them that might have existed in Propaganda Due among, like, the sort of Iranian intelligence and Savak with some of these groups.
Definitely. And we will, I think next week we're going to get into the actual kind of Contra part, more of the Contra part of the Iran, because I think, honestly, I think that the Contra half is more shocking and disturbing and kind of totally, like, criminal in a way that you could come up for excuses why people would be covertly selling arms to Iran for geopolitical reasons, and it's not a great thing to do, but is it the most kind of satanic thing you could imagine?
No.
I mean, it's like we were supporting the Shah, and that was totally okay, even though he was, you know, murdering and torturing people. So I think, and I noticed that, like, even calling it Iran-Contra, there was always an emphasis in the mainstream media when they finally did report on it that it was all about, like, this Iran thing because they're supposed to be the bad guys. They're supposed to be our enemies. There was, like, this obsession over, like, well, Mr. Reagan, like, you are a big tough guy, but here you are, like selling weapons to the bad people. And I feel like that was a very establishment-friendly way of looking at Iran-Contra, whereas if you focused more on, like, the Contras and the death squads and the drug trafficking, that's, like, holy shit. And that affects people in the United States like way more profoundly, and led so directly to like horrible crimes and murder and death and rape and everything that and is so obviously like an expression of imperialism and us like doing really horrible things to like crush countries that want different political systems than the ones we want. And
exactly.
So,
it's just like the whole aspect of like Iran or selling weapons to them just goes to show like the hypocrisy and like the cynicism of their superficial politics and all this. Like it's just and these things, they don't necessarily map like clearly onto like the sort of like U.S. versus Iran, or even the sort of Iranian paradigm of like the great Shaitan and the Shaitan al-Akbar, that type of thing. Like there's these sort of networks that these people were embedded in. Like a lot of the time they sneak across like these sort of grand geopolitical alignments.
Sure.
For
you could
whatever.
you could almost guarantee it was almost like a good cover for like the worst parts of the scandal, where it's like what are people supposed to think when they find out that like Israel was covertly in on this, and like they're supposed to be the ultimate enemies, and like I think it's just meant to kind of like make people scratch their heads a little bit and be like, I guess this is what politics is. Like, this is just some crazy geopolitics makes strange bedfellows. And, it's a little unseemly that they all lied about it, but you can kind of understand why they would. And, I mean, even calling the book Trick or Treason, I guess that would be the logical kind of conclusion you would ask, like, is this treason? I think for most Americans, the more relevant thing is that they like manipulated, I guess they like delayed the release of the hostages. Though I think the odds that the hostages were going to like die or something like that was probably low. I mean, you could make the argument that like they were, but it feels a little Russia-gatey in terms of like, you're not listening to our intelligence services, Mr. President. Like, like you need to protect American lives at all costs. And like you played politics with the hostages, and that in a kind of very establishment kind of way that, you could see how that is kind of, that would count as like a mark against you.
And it's true. And I think that even in Russiagate, there were angles they could have taken that would have been like better or more effective, and also like more like important and like more like vindicated or more justified than like what they did. But they just love to be like, sir, like how dare you, like you disrespected Colonel Vindman or like whatever, like that's like I think that even the whole thing of like one day like they'll be Russia again, like they'll be like a fascist like oligarchy or whatever, like once again, like there's even agencies like within the whole like the map, like the geography of it like is very like what's the best way to put it? It's like rhizomatic, it's not necessarily like this place versus this place, it's
and I think it's interesting that Michael Ledeen was involved in all this stuff and then ended up butting up with General Flynn, who was kind of the most significant government official to kind of push a certain like conservative rapprochement with Russia circa 5 years ago, and kind of got like hosed for it and like thrown in jail for a little while. But I think that I think that kind of sums up like his mentality, and maybe like a Michael Ledeen kind of thing of like, we made Russia like capitalist and Christian again. So therefore, like, we ought to, and I'm sure if they were able to overthrow the government of Iran and put some kind of Western puppet in their place,
it's so awful to contemplate, like,
they would be back on the loving Iran train, which they were on prior to 1979. I mean, all these people had very strong ties with Iran and were, appreciated their culture. But, I think that kind of, the degree to which you're an other is definitely contingent on your political relationship with the U.S.
Even some of these dudes like Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, I feel like now he's all about like being on the grift of like, the regime is gonna collapse like any day now, and like we need to get like such and such like in there. Like obviously we talked about his MEK connections, and like that's one of the big boosters in the United States of that type of thing. It's been deep in the world of like, Iran commentary and, always sharing their views on, what needs to happen for the future of Iran. But yeah, like, it's, for sure. And there's definitely like that type of thing, like, circulating around. Just your head spins when you really just start thinking about all of the like ridiculous things you've heard about like America's like designs for the future of Iran or what like needs to happen. It's just like an absurd arrogance that is just tolerated in American society, where it's like pontificating about like what should happen to Iran is just like so normal. But anyway,
unfortunately they've racked up quite a bit of experience in toppling like every Eastern Bloc country now, so they feel like maybe they have a roadmap towards a westernization roadmap, probably really to like steal all their resources and like gut their public sectors and reduce them to a vassal state, which is pretty much what exclusively happens to all countries that have like defected to the Western camp, or they just become like a tourist trap country in the EU.
It's a tragic situation. Like, the fate of, you can see the fate of the GCC countries, not that they were ever like beacons of like, autonomy or whatever, but, it's just,
the heavy influence of being tied to the Great Satan.
Yeah, they're definitely in the throes of the Great Satan.
It comes at a cost,
and you can see the the history being written, the surface history being written, like the great spiritual custodians of the two holy mosques, repudiated the anti-Semitic idea of Palestine or whatever, and showed that this hatred does not represent Islam. The Fourth Reich of Palestine was crushed by an international alliance. It's despicable.
Oh God. We're gonna next week we're gonna find even more Nazis involved in this whole web. But I think for now we'll leave it there. Next public episode next week is gonna be a part 2 about the real meat of Iran-Contra. And what kind of world all these sketchy characters won by doing the October surprise. In 1980. So we will see you all then.
Or subscribe to Alwara.
Yes,
we're doing an
Alwara
episode
frequency.
Yes.
We will see you before then. We got a couple, maybe a little 2-part bonus episode. That might have dropped by the time we post this, but gonna be some good juicy dark content out there. You can go to patreon.com/subliminaljihad and get on that frequency. But if not, come back next time for part 2, Smuggler's Blues. And until then, dear listeners, stay vigilant.
Peace.
Well, the first thing I want to say is mandate my ass. Because it seems as though we've been convinced that 26% of the registered voters, not even 26% of the American people, but 26% of the registered voters form a mandate or a landslide. 21% voted for Skippy and 3-4% voted for somebody else who might have been running. But I remember in this year that we have now declared the year from Shogun to Reagan, I remember what I said about Reagan. Meant it. Acted like an actor. Hollywood. Acted like a liberal. Acted like General Franco when he acted like governor of California. Then he acted like a Republican. Then he acted like somebody was going to vote for him for president. And now we act like 26% of the registered voters is actually a mandate. We're all actors in this, I suppose. What has happened is that in the last 20 years, America has changed from a producer to a consumer. And all consumers know that when the producer names the tune, the consumer has got to dance. That's the way it is. We used to be a producer, very inflexible at that, and now we are consumers and finding it difficult to understand. natural resources and minerals will change your world. The Arabs used to be in the third world. They have bought the second world and put a firm down payment on the first one. Controlling your resources will control your world. This country has been surprised by the way the world looks now. They don't know if they want to be Matt Dillon or Bob Dylan. They don't know if they want to be diplomats or continue the same policy of nuclear nightmare diplomacy. John Foster Dulles ain't nothing but the name of an airport now. The idea concerns the fact that this country wants nostalgia. They want to go back as far as they can, even if it's only as far as last week. Not to face now or tomorrow, but to face backwards. And yesterday was the day of our cinema heroes riding to the rescue at the last possible moment. The day of the man in the white hat or the man on the white horse. Or the man who always came to save America at the last moment. Someone always came to save America at the last moment, especially in B-movies. And when America found itself having a hard time facing the future, they looked for people like John Wayne. But since John Wayne was no longer available, they settled for Ronald Reagan. And it has placed us in a situation that we can only look at like a B-movie. Come with us back to those inglorious days when heroes weren't zeros, before fair was square, when the cavalry came straight away and all American men were like Hemingway, to the days of the wondrous B-movie. The producer, underwritten by all the millionaires necessary, will be Casper the Defensive Weinberger. No more animated a choice is available. The director will be Attila the Hague, running around frantically declaring himself in control and in charge. The ultimate realization of the inmates taking over at the asylum. The screenplay will be adapted from the book called Voodoo Economics by George Papa Doc Bush. Music by the village people, the very military macho man. A theme song for saber rattling and selling wars door to door. Remember, we're looking for the closest thing we can find to John Wayne. Cliches abound like kangaroos, courtesy of some spaced out Marlon Perkins, a Reagan contemporary. Cliches like itchy trigger finger and tall in the saddle and riding off or on into the sunset. Cliches like get off of my planet by sundown. More so than cliches like he died with his boots on. Marine tough, the man is Bogart tough, the man is Cagney tough, the man is Hollywood tough, the man is cheap steak tough, and Bonzo substantial. The ultimate in synthetic selling, a Madison Avenue masterpiece, a miracle, a cotton candy politician, pesto macho, macho, man. Put your orders in, America, and quick as Kodak, your leaders duplicate with the accent being on the dupes. Because all of a sudden we have fallen prey to selective amnesia, remembering what we want to remember and forgetting what we choose to forget. All of a sudden the man who called for a bloodbath on our college campuses is supposed to be Dudley goddamn do-right. You go give them liberals hell, Ronnie. That was the mandate to the new Captain Bligh on the new ship of fools. It was doubtlessly based on his chameleon performance of the past as a liberal Democrat, as the head of the Studio Actors Guild. When other celluloid saviors were cringing in terror from McCarthy, Ron stood tall. It goes all the way back from Hollywood to hillbilly, from liberal to libelous, from Bonzo to Birchite or Born Again. Civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, it's all wrong. Call in the cavalry to disrupt this perception of freedom gone wild. God damn it, first one wants freedom, then the whole damn world wants freedom. Nostalgia, that's what we want. The good old days, when we gave them hell. When the buck stopped somewhere and you could still buy something with it. To a time when movies was in black and white, and so was everything else. Even if we go back to the campaign trail, before Six-Gun Ron shot off his face and developed hoof and mouth. Before the free press went down before full court press and were reluctant to view the menu because they knew the only thing available was Crow. Lon Chaney, our man of 1,000 faces. No match for Ron. Doug Henning does the makeup. Special effects from Grecian Formula 16 and Crazy Glue. Transportation furnished by the David Rockefeller Remote Control Company. Their slogan is, why wait for 1984? You can panic now and avoid the rush. So much for the good news. As Wall Street goes, so goes the nation. And here's a look shaky, war items are hot, the house claims all ties. Jobs are down, money is scarce, and common sense is at an all-time low in heavy trading. Movies were looking better than ever, and now no one is looking because we're starring in a big movie. And we would rather had John Wayne. We would rather had John Wayne. And you don't need to be in no hurry. And you ain't never really got to worry. And you don't need to check on how you feel. Just keep repeating that none of this is real. And if you're sensing that something's wrong, well, just remember that it won't be too long before the director cuts the scene. Yeah.